for joining me today. Before I get started, I'd like to talk a little bit about Donald Trump and NATO. Good morning there, NATO. How are you doing today? U.S. President Donald Trump is touting his influence over the NATO military alliance, which he says calls me daddy in an interview that focused in part on his vision for Europe. His vision for Europe. Watch out. Law enforcement. So daddy, what's with that term? Well, law enforcement flag terms like daddy because they often indicate grooming patterns, incest role play, coercive framing, escalation risk. It's a behavioral marker, not just vocabulary. And all that disgusting child sex abuse materials or the CSAM materials, daddy is used to overwrite a child's sense of safety and replace it with submission. It's not slang, it's not by an accident, it's for control. And the same daddy group are meeting in Europe. They're gathered in Brussels, my favorite place. Too bad I'll never get to visit. Brussels summit, where a momentous decision will be taking place over whether to loan Ukraine tens of billions of euros in frozen Russian assets to fund its military and economic needs. Get that money back to those mafia members, right? Most of Russia's money's been held by the EU in Belgium. So, yeah, they're such lovely people, lovely, lovely people. Call them daddy. Next time you think of one of them, call them daddy. And now Trump is announcing drug price cuts. This is so much like a mafia. Hey, Guido, we got to get some better prices on those drugs. We got to tell these people something. We've been trying to negotiate for what, 30, 40 years? And now we're admitting that we're controlled and run by pharma companies. We got to beg for them for some discounts, and they're going to give you some discounts. Hey, I got an idea. Everybody thinking about getting off of those drugs? Prices shouldn't matter. Your sanity and your safety should. I'll have more about that at the very end. But today, my goal, well, I do have one, believe it or not, is to put some things in order. Have you ever wondered about who comes up with the rules about who you can make slurs about? Well, I got the answer for you. For a long time, we've also been told that what happened to Native Americans during the uranium era was a tragic, it was accidental. We couldn't help ourselves, or simply the result of ignorance. That story isn't quite correct. The United States has described itself in its own words as an experiment. I've heard a lot of them say it. George Herbert Walker Bush, well, the United States is an experiment. An experiment in government, economics, and expansion. But experiments require test conditions. And historically, those conditions fall hardest on people with the least legal protection. You'll start to sniff out. I'm going to be talking a little bit about these lawyers, right? The country itself chose a system where power flows through legal definitions rather than a democracy. And those native nations, they were placed in that position early on. They weren't fully sovereign. They were here first, remember that. They were not fully protected. Their land was controlled by the federal government once they beat them out of the way. It was leased by outside companies and regulated loosely or not at all. That mattered when the Cold War began and uranium suddenly became one of the most valuable materials on Earth. Uranium was not only found on native land, it existed in many places. But native land was where risk could be shifted, where workers were easier to ignore, lawsuits were harder to file, and long term health consequences could be delayed, denied, or buried. Inside those mines, people were exposed to radiation or something we're thinking is radiation. We're going to have a lot of thinking today. They claim that the mines are mining uranium, but radiation was not the only hazard. Sulfur compounds from fuels, blasting, and acidic mine environments damage lungs and weaken the body. extreme heat inside poorly ventilated mines and pay attention to the heat part. That increased breathing rates and an intensified exposure just because of the heat. Pay attention to heat. Together, radiation, sulfur, and heat didn't just harm people, they multiplied each other. So later, when the damage became impossible to deny, the story was narrowed. This is how it works. Those attorneys move in. They have to decide how and where people are going to sue. You don't just get to decide who you're going to sue. Forget that. That is not reality. So radiation was acknowledged, but sulfur was treated as background noise. Heat was ignored entirely, not because they were harmless, but because they were legally inconvenient. And there's huge impacts. I've talked about this in the past. In my house here, we are so much sicker during the summertime, and I kept thinking it has to do with the heat. And that is, in fact, what my instincts were telling me is true. Yes, in the heat, it hangs in the air, and it is horrific around here. Also, because we had all of these access to these lawsuits, which we've never had because of the Indians who filed lawsuits. I had access to more information about how mental health has been affected. I've been saying for a long time, I'm convinced that all these people that have all these mental conditions likely from inside of their very own homes. And so what they do is they narrow these things, just like they did with the hotels. How law decides and who absorbs the risk, and how entire populations can be turned into sacrifice zones without anyone ever saying a word out loud. For example, try to slur, but do it in a safe way. Even Yandex, my favorite Russian search engine, now has AI. Well, you can't say anything bad about two groups, the gypsies or the Jews. Don't be messing around and slurring them, but just test it out a little bit. I mean, I wouldn't go publicly on social media and do it, but I would try it on AI. I've done it on all of them. Yeah, doesn't turn out well. No one will talk to you. When you make that slur about the gypsies or Jews on social media, the search engines will lock you out. But you can slur the Indians all you want. You can come up with football teams and stuff, show them with tomahawks in their hands and stuff. It's okay to slur those people. So I'll get that more about how that all worked out. So why no slurring of gypsies and Jews? But Indians, hey, slur away. They're just those old drunken people over there on those reservations, right? That's the image everybody wants to hear about them, right? So let me back off here a second and start to talk about some of these things going on. Let's get back to basics here. Uranium. Where'd that come from? It came from Uranus in 1789. I have a hard time not laughing at this point. Uranium equals came from Uranus. Your anus. Your ass. Excuse my boldness with my language. So uranium came from Uranus. Starts to sound a little bit suspicious right off the bat here, right? Then we had plutonium. That came from Pluto in 1940. So, what actually happened in 1781, astronomer William Herschel discovered Uranus or your ass, however you want to word this stuff, right? This is not a coincidence or a mistake. Just pay attention to what these words are saying, and then you're going to have to decide, is any of this stuff real, or is this all pointing back to sulfur, but we have a bunch of fancy names surrounding it. So this was the first new planet discovered in recorded history. Uranus. Okay, so the first one they discovered in 1781, gee, suspiciously around the time they likely took over, it was not known in any of the ancient literature, supposedly, right? So, the discovery electrified European science. It symbolized that nature still had fundamental secrets that right when they discovered it, right? So, in 1789, German, get it? German chemist Martin Heinrich Klaproth analyzed a black material called pitchblende from Bohemia. Klaproth isolated what he believed was a new metal, but it was actually uranium oxide, but the element was new. This occurred during the chemical revolution when chemistry was being rebuilt on measurement and classification. Rebuilt, right? So before, science was pretty much they reported to the royals and it was guesswork, right? So why would they name it after Uranus? Let's look at the official story. Klaproth explicitly said he named the element uranium to honor the recently discovered planet Uranus. Why this makes me laugh like a 5-year-old, I don't know. And that was to align chemistry with a new astronomy. I would never have the time or interest to make this kind of stuff up. So this followed the Enlightenment logic. A new planet means a new element, a new sky, a new matter. So it was a statement that chemistry belonged with astronomy as a modern science, not medieval alchemy. So why Uranus specifically, according to them? Uranus was new, not mythologically ancient. Yeah. It represented breaking past the classical limits, the 7 known planets. Naming the element after Uranus signaled modernity, discovery beyond tradition, and the expansion of scientific authority or scientific trickery. What this did symbolically, it implied the periodic table was not closed. Earth's matter was not fully known. Human reason could still uncover deep hidden forces. This was the same year as the French Revolution. Off with their heads! An era obsessed with overthrowing old orders, including scientific ones. But this is important to know. Klaproth did not isolate pure metallic uranium. That came later in 1841 on this other person, Pelagat. But the name stuck because the symbolic move mattered more than the metallurgy, or so according to the story, right? So uranium was named after Uranus because both represented the same idea in 1789, a breakthrough beyond the known world. The element did not come from the planet, but from the authority to name it came from the sky. So, why the name Pluto? The name Pluto was chosen for both the planet in 1930 and later echoed in plutonium in 1941 for reasons that are symbolic, historical, and importantly, intentional. Yeah, it's just like they came up with Disney. There's a dog named Pluto. Yeah, all of this was intentional. So Pluto, the planet, becomes discovered in 1930. And this, the planet was discovered by Lowell Observatory. I don't know if that's their real name, but really, who cares at this point? They're long dead. The name Pluto was proposed by Venetian Burney, an 11-year-old in England, and adopted by the astronomers. Well, that was good to find out, right? So Pluto, an 11-year-old girl in England, came up with a name. And Pluto was compelling for several reasons. Pluto means the Roman god of the underworld, ruler of hidden realms, associated with darkness, distance, and invisibility. It fit a cold, remote, faint object at the edge of the solar system. Mythologically, Pluto was tied to wealth buried underground, like ore or metals. And there was also a practical reason. PL, which is the term on the thing they use for the element, PL matched Percivio Lobel's initials, honoring the Observer's founder. Boy, they have quite the stories, don't they? So, plutonium, the element, 1940. Got it named just in time, right? It was discovered by Glenn T. Seaborg's team at UC Berkeley. But why the name plutonium? Well, the name followed a deliberate sequence. Uranium came from Uranus. Nepotism came from Neptune. Plutonium came from Pluto. But it was not just a pattern exercise, symbolic reasons. Pluto, the god of the underworld, because plutonium is invisible, extremely dangerous, associated with death, tied to weapons of mass destruction. The symbolism fit too well to be accidental. Seaborg later acknowledged that the name reflected the element's deadly nature, its hidden power, its role in a secret weapons program. So, Pluto was the outermost known planet, mythologically, the realm of death, scientifically, the last new planet of the era. Naming the element after Pluto symbolized the final descent from the sky, sea, and underworld, from Uranus to Neptune to Pluto. So, why did this matter? Well, plutonium was discovered on the eve of World War II, just in the nick of time. It was discovered inside a classified nuclear weapons program. But was it, or are we talking about sulfur during a moment when science crossed from discovery into existential threat? So, they claim the name quietly acknowledged that boundary. So, Pluto was chosen because it meant the hidden god of death beneath the earth. Pretty funny, huh? For the planet, it fit its dangerous and distance. For plutonium, it fit its role in the underworld of modern science, powerful, secret, and lethal. But what about the word sulfur? Unlike uranium or plutonium, sulfur's name is ancient, practical, and pre scientific. It does not come from astronomy or mystic naming trends of the modern era. It comes from direct human experience with the substance itself. The origin of the word is Latin, sulfur, Sulfur, also spelled sulfur, Sulphur in British usage, meaning this: burning stone, brimstone, or that which burns and stinks. The word was already in common use in Roman times and likely older and likely inherited from Italic languages, possibly Greek. There was no single god named Sulfur like Uranus or Pluto. But here's where it gets very interesting. In English, sulfur was long called brimstone. In those churches, bring the fire and brimstone down and kill all of you. Yeah, that's where that word came from. All that fire and brimstone. So, so it literally means burning stone. This matters because sulfur burns with a blue flame. It produces choking acidic fumes or SO2. It is associated with volcanoes, fires, and decay. Fire and brimstone, hell, punishment, corruption, and plague. This was an I can't say that word. Anyway, so yeah, that's where that fire and brimstone, all those preachers are yelling about. Let them rain down on hell on all of you sinners, that fire and brimstone. Yeah. Okie dokie. So, why sulfur was not renamed in the modern era? Sulfur was already widely used. widely feared, widely understood in practical terms. It was one of the classic substances of alchemy. Alchemists called sulfur one of the tria prima. Sulfur, combustibility, the soul, volatility. Mercury, fluidity, spirit. And salt, solidity, and the body. Even when chemistry professionalized, the older name stuck. So, what sulfur's name tells you and how it was viewed. So, yeah, sulfur belongs to a pre scientific world before mines, fires, disease, decay, hell imagery, and industry. It was named by people who handle it directly, not by people doing theory. So, sulfur's name encodes danger, combustion, toxicity, immediacy. But modern regulation often treats sulfur compounds as odor nuisances, secondary pollutants, industrial byproducts. The name remembers what the paperwork forgets. Sulfur is called sulfur because people smelled it, burned it, and suffered from it long before modern science existed. So let's talk about how do they generate electricity. And you'll find that none of this is complicated. Just open your minds up. This is not complicated at all. So we're going to go step by step. So, how do they generate or make electricity? You're going to think, oh, get out of here. We know this stuff. No, we got to go step by step. Well, in the nuclear plants, the steam spins the turbines. In the coal plants, the steam spins the turbines also. In the gas mining, hot gas spins the turbine. So as you can see, also in hydro, falling water spins the turbine. And wind, the blades spin the turbines. The solar, though, is different. It creates DC power and convert it to AC. All of them end up producing AC electricity at 60 cycles per second or 60 Hz. All you have to know. So all of these places, the power plants, the nuclear plants, the where they're getting the coal from and the wind, they all have to spin. They have to spin that thing to make it into electricity. Okay, that's all that happens. And each place spins the turbine and it's produced by steam in the nuclear and the coal sections. Okay. The operation of the vast majority of power plants is based on the principle of converting the energy from various types of motors into mechanical energy of rotation of the rotor of an electric generator. Afterward, it is converted into electricity. There are also facilities for the direct conversion of energy into electrical energy. For example, photovoltaic plants take advantage of solar energy. So once heat is produced, everything that follows is ordinary engineering. Heat boils water. Steam expands rapidly. Steam spins turbines. Turbines generate electricity. Steam condenses back into water. Then the cycle repeats. So another word you're going to be hearing today is the word yellow cake. Yellow cake is a yellow powder. Visually, texturally, it strongly resembles sulfur. In modern chemistry, sulfur is just an element on the periodic table. But in older alchemy frameworks, sulfur represented something broader, the principle of fire in matter, the energetic or combustine aspect trapped within substances. This is striking because nuclear physics frequently describes reactor energy as the power of the sun released on Earth. That phrasing mirrors the alchemy idea of sulfur almost exactly. So what is yellow cake? Yellow cake is not raw uranium and not nuclear fuel. It is a concentrated uranium powder produced partway through mining and processing. The chemical name uranium oxide concentrate. The common formula U2, I think that's U3OS. Well, you can check my facts. I have it all on my website. Don't go try to make some without checking my numbers here. So, the physical form, yellow to yellow brown powder, and the texture is similar to cake flour or cornmeal. That's why they call it yellow cake. Miners and engineers start calling it yellow cake because it is yellow. It looks like a fine cake mix. It comes out of processing vats as a powder or slurry that dries into cakes. So, how yellow cake is made? Uranium ore is mined from rock. The ore is crushed and ground. Chemicals, often sulfuric acid or alkaline solutions, dissolve uranium. Uranium is precipitated out of that solution. The solid is dried into a yellow powder. That dried powder is yellow cake. And this usually takes place at uranium mills, in situ recovery processing plants. So, uranium oxides naturally form yellow-orange compounds when oxidized. The yellow color comes from uranium's electron structure. Light absorption in oxidized uranium compounds. This is standard chemistry. So, why don't they use yellow cake directly? Well, it cannot power a reactor. It cannot explode. It is not enriched. It is not usable in weapons. To become a fuel, it must go through conversion, enrichment, and fuel fabrication. Yellow cake is only step one. Is yellow cake dangerous? Yes, it is. It's chemically toxic, a heavy metal. It's weakly radioactive. Pay attention to that part. Risks come from inhalation of the dust, long term exposure, poor handling practices. It is far less radioactive than reactor fuel or waste, but still hazardous. Don't know why that is. So, the term yellow cake became common during early uranium mining from the 1930s to the 1940s. The Manhattan Project made it popular, and because of Western U.S. uranium boom. The name was informal, spread quickly in mining culture, was later adopted into official usage. So essentially, uranium is called yellow cake at an intermediate processing stage because uranium oxide concentrate dries into a yellow powder that looks like cake mix, and the nickname stuck. So, sulfur, you might be thinking, well, yeah, I know about sulfur. Don't bother me with that stuff. Sulfur comes out of mines. Well, I got a big surprise for you today. Yeah, sulfur can come out of mines, but the sulfur we're talking about did not come out of mines. That is the absolutely, well, pretty evil, right? But I'll get to that in a second here. Let me go through the basics here. The element name is sulfur, Sulfur. The symbol is S. The atomic number is 16. Two eights, right? They love that number 8. The category is non-metal. At room temperature, it is a solid. Sulfur readily forms compounds by bonding with other elements, especially oxygen and hydrogen. So, sulfur can be found in the Earth's crust with minerals and ores, in crude oil, coal, and natural gas, in volcanic gases. And the interesting part, sulfur also is found around data centers. So, sulfur almost never acts alone. Its effect depends on what form it takes. Sulfur dioxide, or SO2, is an air pollutant, lung irritant. Hydrogen sulfur, or H2S, is a toxic gas that smells like rotten eggs. Sulfuric acid, or H2SO4, highly corrosive industrial acid. Sulfates, or SO4 3, common in soil, water, and fertilizers. And then the elemental sulfur, the S, which is solid yellow powder or crystals. So its uses are in fertilizers, largest use worldwide, chemical manufacturing, petroleum refining, metal processing, batteries and industrial acids, pharmaceuticals, and rubber production. So, sulfur is essential at trace levels in the body. It is harmful when inhaled as gas or mist. Chronic exposure to sulfur compounds can affect lungs, eyes, skin, and the nervous system. Sulfur is a naturally occurring chemical element that is essential to life in small amounts, but hazardous in many industrial and airborne forms, depending entirely on its chemical state. Sulfur is not usually manufactured from nothing. It is released, converted, or concentrated from materials that already contain sulfur. Most fuel, ores, and waste streams already contain sulfur atoms. Human activity changes their form. When materials containing sulfur are burned, the sulfur combines with oxygen. This creates sulfur gases, not solid sulfur. And that is where you get the sulfur dioxide, the sulfur trioxide. These can later form sulfuric acid mist in the air. What you need to look for are words like dioxide. Dioxide simply means a combination of things. So when you hear sulfur dioxide, you should realize you're talking pretty dangerous area. And I also found sulfur in those burn pits in Iraq. I've been talking for a long time about those poor deformed children in Iraq. It took years, and now the children are coming up with horrific deformed things. And I believe it happened with these burn pits because these burn pits are releasing sulfur. So the burn pits burned fuel, plastics, rubber, electronics, medical waste, food waste, treated wood, and auto ammunition residues. Yeah, instead of having trash pickup, they just burned it all and said, "Oh, it's fine, nothing to see here." But many of these contained sulfur or sulfur containing chemicals. But the burn pits do not create elemental sulfur, but they create sulfur gases and aerosols, which are often more biologically harmful than solid sulfur. So, coal, oil, and diesel naturally contain sulfur, but when burned, sulfur becomes the gas. With hot exhaust and moisture, you get the acid aerosols. This is one of the largest global sulfur sources. Scrubbers, what they do is they scrub off the sulfur. Yeah, it's really crazy. Scrubbers may capture some sulfur, but backup generators, military equipment, older plants often release it directly. So, crude oil contains sulfur compounds. During refining, sulfur is chemically stripped out to meet fuel standards. This produces elemental sulfur as a byproduct. This is not mining sulfur, it is recovering sulfur that was already inside oil. So that sulfur then gets melted, solidified, stored in yellow blocks or pellets, and it gets sold cheaply for industry. This is why modern sulfur supply is tightly linked to oil refinery. So many ores contain sulfur bearing minerals or sulfides. During mining and processing, crushing and exposure to air releases sulfur compounds. Acid leaching, which is often sulfuric acid, converts sulfur states. Heat and oxidation create sulfur gases underground. Mining does not create sulfur, but it liberates sulfur compounds from rock and concentrates them in air, water, and dust. Organic waste also contains sulfur. When it is decomposes without oxygen, it produces hydrogen sulfide, common near landfills, sewage plants, pits, and stagnant water. This gas is extremely toxic at high concentrates. So we already know that nature supposedly produces sulfur through volcanoes, hot springs, ocean plankton, or decaying organic matter. Human activity dramatically accelerates and concentrates sulfur release, especially combustion, industrial refining, mining, and waste burning. The danger is not sulfur's existence, it is rate, concentration, and form. So, those burn pits, why were they so harmful? Well, burn pits contain high heat, mixed materials, no emission controls, continuous exposure. That created sulfur gases, acid aerosols, fine particulates that carry sulfur deep into the lungs. This is chemically different and often more damaging than controlled industrial sulfur release. So, sulfur is released or converted by human activity when when excuse me. Sulfur is released or converted by human activity when sulfur containing fuels, waste, or ores are burned, refined, or processed, transforming bound sulfur into gases, acids, or concentrated solids that can be inhaled or dispersed into the environment. So, there's a very famous part of this country that's called Cancer Alley. So, where's Cancer Alley? Well, Cancer Alley refers to an 85-mile industrial corridor along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. It contains oil refineries, petrochemical plants, plastics and fertilizer facilities, sulfur recovery units, waste incinerators. This is one of the densest concentrations of heavy industry on the entire earth. Yes, that 85-mile industrial corridor along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans is considered one of the deadliest concentrations of heavy industry on the entire earth. Quite a statement, huh? So, what they do is they scrape it off. That's what it's called. In Louisiana refineries and chemical plants, crude oil and gas arrive loaded with sulfur. Regulations require sulfur to be removed from fuels. plants use chemical processes to strip sulfur compounds out. So this produces elemental sulfur, all those dangerous sulfur gases, the sulfuric acid mist, and sulfur bearing particles. So emissions are controlled. Scrubbers capture most sulfur. Leaks are within limits. So they say that no system is airtight. Startups, shutdowns, flarings, and accidents release sulfur. Aging equipment leaks sulfur. Heat and humidity worsen dispersion and chemistry. But some sulfur escapes. It's all been documented. Why this area is so poor and so sick? Well, it's not by accident. This corridor was deliberately built where land was cheap, flood prone. Isn't that interesting? Flood prone land was their choice, right? I guess when the floods hit, then they wash all that stuff into the waterways and into your drinking. This is about eugenics, so just don't lose sight of that. So, anyhow, so let me see here. Land was cheap, flood prone, politically weak, historically black community, and many of those descendants were from enslaved people. And they lacked legal and financial power, a deadly combination in this country. This pattern is called industrial city inequity. Companies did not say, who cares, but the systems functioned as if that were the outcome. So, how this exposure happens, and it does not happen from big spills. This is the part that everybody needs to pay attention to. People imagine pollution as giant disasters. In reality, it comes from chronic low level exposure, daily emissions, nighttime releases, flaring events, heat driven chemistry, inhalation of fine aerosols. Sulfur compounds are dangerous because they form acid aerosols. They penetrate deep into the lungs. They inflame tissue chronically. But the symptoms are often misclassified as asthma, anxiety, smoking related illness, or lifestyle disease. And this masks the causation. So, why it persists? Well, we're in the USA. Yay, yay, USA. Kill those people. Kill them more. Yay, yay, USA. If they're black, kill them faster. So, permits allow emissions below legal thresholds, all carved out by those attorneys. Health effects are assessed as chemical by chemical. Cumulative exposure is rarely counted, and that's what this is all about, cumulative exposure. Also, let's not forget the legal barriers. Proving causation is extremely difficult. Burden is on residents, not companies. Long latency cancers weaken lawsuits. Jobs versus health becomes the framing. Communities are economically trapped. Leaving is too expensive and most cannot afford to leave. But is this unique to Louisiana? No, Louisiana is just the most visible. Similar dynamics exist in Texas Gulf Coast, Ohio River Valley, West Virginia, Navajo Nation, and the California Central Valley. Louisiana stands out because everything is concentrated and humid, which worsens chemical behavior. No one explicitly decided that poor communities don't matter, but industry seeks low resistance. Policy prioritizes production. Health impacts are delayed. Legal systems demand near impossible proof. The result is predictable harm in predictable places. So, Cancer Alley exists because sulfur and petrochemical pollutants are stripped, processed, and released in one of the poorest regions of the country where chronic exposure is normalized, legally fragmented, and politically easy to overlook. So I went looking a little bit further. Always look at the root. Where did these people in Louisiana, where exactly did they come from? The communities in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, largely descendants from enslaved people and freedmen. They were established along the Mississippi River generations before oil refineries and petrochemical plants moved in around them during the 20th century. The communities most directly surrounded by refineries and petrochemical plants in Louisiana's Cancer Alley are overwhelmingly African American. Mainly, many of them are descendants from enslaved people and later freedmen who settled the river parishes long before heavy industry arrived. How did it get started? Well, sugar plantations lined the Mississippi River. Enslaved Africans lived and worked along the river corridor. After emancipation, many stayed on or near the same land. This became stable black rural communities with churches, cemeteries, and family land. Cancer Alley, Navajo uranium lands, and West Virginia coal towns all follow the same structural pattern. Long established, low power communities absorb the health costs of industries that arrived later, while legal systems delay recognition and protect producers rather than people. I've talked a lot about in the past, I did an entire show about how hotels were a big part in the trafficking business. Yes, hotels. Let me give you an example. For decades, hotels avoided civil liability for tracking occurring on their premises because courts relied on three doctrines. One, no duty to police third parties. Hotels argued that they were not responsible for crimes committed by guests while they had direct specific knowledge. Two, lack of actual knowledge standard. Plaintiffs had to prove the hotel knew trafficking was happening, not that it should have known. Three, corporation franchising insulation. Major hotel brands claimed the franchisee ran day to day operations. The brand had no control. Therefore, the brand had no liability. Together, these doctrines created near total immunity. So, what changed? Trafficking did not suddenly increase, the legal theory changed. Attorneys reframed the issue from did the hotel commit trafficking to did the hotel knowingly profit from a pattern of exploitation? And that shift is what took place. Should have known replaces actual knowledge. So then courts began accepting evidence such as repeated short stays paid in cash, rooms rented near highways, refusals of housekeeping, staff complaints were ignored, online reviews flagged prostitution. This established constructive knowledge. The Trafficking Victims Protections Reauthorization allows civil suits against entities that knowingly benefit financially or by receiving anything of value from participation in a venture which that person knew or should have known has engaged in trafficking. That language is everything. Knowingly benefit, should have known, participation in a venture, and that collapsed their old definition. So the courts began increasingly recognize that brands set policies, brands train staff, brands control reservation and pricing, brands receive revenue, which makes them participants, not bystanders. Gee, imagine how long that took them to figure this out, right? Talk about a loophole. The delay was not accidental. Liability opens only when evidence becomes overwhelming. Public tolerance collapses. Reputation risk exceeds legal risk. Insurance markets adjust. Courts see a manageable scope of defendants. Until then, harm is treated as isolated, unprovable, someone else's responsibility. This is how systems contain exposure. And this is why it feels like they hit it. And they use the exact same patterns, the exact same PR firms for tobacco, asbestos, lead paint, opioids, PFAS chemicals, clergy abuse, universities and assault, and social media harms. First step, denial, then insulation, then narrow exceptions. Then finally, they let the floodgates open, but not until they get all of the guardrails in order. It is lawyers redefining responsibility once the system can no longer defend the old boundaries. Until then, harm exists in a legal blind spot, or I would say a legal loophole that they themselves were created. So, bottom line, hotels were not immune because trafficking was unknown. They were immune because the law defined knowledge and responsibility in ways that made it untouchable. When those definitions changed, the same behavior became actionable overnight. And they did the exact same thing with the clergy. They did the exact same thing with tobacco. They did the exact same thing, rinse and repeat over and over. So they come up with these laws as long as victims are isolated, records stay sealed, claims expire quietly, institutions retain moral authority. So, and the clergy abuse followed the same stages as hotels and trafficking, asbestos, tobacco, opioids. Yeah, it's always the same patterns. Clergy abuse was not hidden because no one knew. It was hidden because the law defined responsibility, knowledge, and time in ways that made accountability impossible. So, yes, funny how they rigged all this up, right? With those legal attorneys, they define who can sue. Sounds a little bit like, oh, I don't know. So it doesn't sound like democracy, if you ask me. Same way they're running around other countries stealing oil tankers. So they're stealing oil tankers over in Venezuela right now. They're doing that because they can use old um, admiralty laws. The boat is out in the water. They make these allegations. Oh, we got it. It's ours. Historically, great powers justify force using morally elastic categories. They use pirates, smugglers, barbarians, terrorists, and narco traffickers. These categories share a function. They exist outside the moral community and therefore outside legal constraint. Funny how that all works, right? At the same time, oil shipping lanes, tanker seizures, and sanctions are not peripheral. They are core instruments of power. Control of energy and logistics has been a defining feature of global dominance since World War II. So, how did the USA get in the cat seat? Well, historically, the US during World War II, they destroyed peer industrial powers. The U.S. inherited financial, naval, and energy leverage. The U.S. came up with Bretton Woods and locked in monetary advantage. The U.S. military force protected trade routes. Law followed power, not the reverse. This was not accidental and not purely defensive, it was systematic consolidation. The experiment succeeded by its own metrics. So, empires tend to look, let me see here. Wait a second. I'm having trouble keeping track here for a second. Okay, got it. Okay. So the experiment is no longer contained, and the justifications are increasingly blunt, calling them unlawful combatants, classified findings, no judicial review, preemptive reinforcement. These phrases are markers of a system operating beyond consent. So, late Rome, late British Empire, late Qing, late Bourbon France, they all share the same thing: extraterritorial violence, legal dualism, law at home, force abroad, economic extraction enforced militarily, growing reliance on classification rather than consent. None of these places collapsed because they were just evil. Their collapse became their legal logic stopping persuading themselves. The American experiment has evolved from a constitutional test into a global enforcement system where legality is increasingly determined by executive classifications rather than public law. This creates a form of managed lawlessness. Calling this an experiment run wild is not hyperbole. It is a description of scope without restraint. Experiments are supposed to have defined limits, ethical oversight, and clear endpoints. But this experiment from the US has now expanded globally. What happened was the Great Experiment. Prominent founders and early elites explicitly framed the United States this way. And these are examples used in historical scholarship. As a matter of fact, on my website, at the bottom of my website, I have so many sources of everybody who has written about these great experiments, everybody who's written about the United States and their founding with the natives and all that. All of them are over there for you to reference for yourself. So, George Washington referred to the Republic as an experiment in self government whose success was uncertain. Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist #1 that Americans were deciding whether societies of men are really capable of not establishing good governments from reflection and choice. James Madison described the Constitution as a novel framework whose durability was unproven. Thomas Jefferson repeatedly referred to Republican government as an ongoing experiment that might fail. So, in elite terms, this meant no inherited legitimacy, unlike monarchs. Over, over outcomes mattered more than principles. Adjustments were expected in parts of the population, and that interfered with the results. So, what experiment actually signified? In elite usage, experiment did not mean equal participation. It did not mean universal rights. It did not mean moral neutrality. It meant testing whether a large, diverse territory could be governed efficiently, testing how much popular input could be tolerated without instability, testing how law, property, and force could be balanced, testing whether expansion, extraction, and consolidation could coexist with normal democracy. Experiments have variables. Certain populations were treated as variables, not participants. And this is very important to know about. From the beginning, several groups were explicitly outside the experiment, for the experiment's protected class. And those people were native nations, enslaved Africans, non property holding whites, women, and later immigrant laborers and the poor. Native Americans, in particular, were never considered part of the political experiment. They were treated as obstacles to territorial testing, subjects of administrative policy, legal edge cases rather than rights bearing citizens. That made it easier to rewrite treaties, redefine sovereignty, shift jurisdictions when convenient. In experimental terms, they were environmental, not the researchers. When elites often speak of the Constitution as if it were sacred today, originally it was closer to a prototype designed to be amended, designed to centralize power gradually, designed to resolve elite conflicts more than popular ones. This is why early amendments focus on structure, not equality. Protections were unevenly enforced. Expansion required constant legal improvisation, as experiments assume failure is acceptable as long as the system survives. When modern elites say America is an experiment, they're often signaling outcomes matter more than consistency. Rights are conditional on stability. Law is adaptive, not fixed. Sacrifices are inevitable and unevenly distributed. It also provides cover. Failures become growing pains. Harm becomes unintentional consequences. Exploitation becomes development. Experiments justify collateral damage. Experiments are run by someone, on someone, for a purpose. Native Americans were never co authors of this experiment. They were among its earliest test subjects. Once that framing is understood, much of the U.S. legal history, especially treaty violations, resource extraction, and jurisdictional manipulation, stops looking like hypocrisy or incompetence. It looks like experimental governance with protected and unprotected clauses. When elites say the United States is an experiment, they are telling the truth, but not the whole truth. It was not an experiment in universal justice. It was an experiment in how far law, power, and expansion could be pushed without collapse. Some groups were the experiment's protections, others were outside it and paid the cost of its success. So I have a huge list of all the historians that have talked about all of this, and it's fascinating stuff. I encourage you to go take a look. So they all have some pretty good theories about this whole um, experiment and everything going. I've spoken in the past more about the other side of it, which was the uh, manifest destiny. But this is actually a legal thing that they've cooked up, right? So yeah, and there's some very good people who have written about all this stuff. This one person described the U.S. as an ongoing experiment in democracy shaped by westward expansion. However, Native Americans appear in his work primarily as conditions, not participants. Yeah, they really have, people have done a lot of work outline all this experiment business. The tragedy of American diplomacy, yeah, it's all an experiment. And it's an experiment that I'm part of because I'm now dying from their fun. But so anyway, so I encourage you to take a look at. Let me just give you a little bit of a definition here because there's just too many for me to go into right this second. What these historians all agreed upon despite their differences. Across ideological lines, most serious historians agree on several points. The U.S. was consciously described as an experiment by its founders. The experiment prioritized stability, expansion, and elite control. Law was designed to be adaptive, not absolute. Inclusion was conditional and revocable. Native Americans were systematically excluded from the system's protections. Where they differ is not whether the United States was an experiment, but whether that experiment should be celebrated, revised, or condemned. What has often been minimized until more recent scholarship is that experiments require subjects. Some subjects had no consent, and the costs were not evenly distributed. Understanding that history classifies what appeals to law, order, and the founder's intent, so often aligned with elite interests, and why Navajo nations experience the American experience not as a promise, but as a process imposed upon them. Everybody's always saying, well, the United States, we're a nation of laws. We are a nation of laws. Well, that phrase, nation of laws, suggests neutrality, fairness, and universality. However, historically, U.S. law has functioned less as a fixed moral framework and more as a flexible administrative tool used to manage populations and resources. Laws are not static. Laws are revised, reinterpreted, exempted, delayed, or selectively enforced. Elite possesses the institution access to influence those changes. The result is not lawlessness, but asymmetric legality, the same legal system producing radically different outcomes for different groups. No group illustrates this better than Native Americans. Treaties were legally binding under U.S. law. They were repeatedly violated, reinterpreted, or nullified when inconvenient. Congress eventually asserted the power to unilaterally alter or terminate treaties. This established a precedent. Law applied to native nations was provisional, not permanent. So, native people were repeatedly reclassified to suit federal needs. They were sovereign nations when negotiating land cessation. They were wards when they were denied rights. They were citizens without full protection. They were non citizens when excluding them from benefits. Each shift served administration of economic objective and not justice. So, when valuable resources were discovered on or near tribal lands like gold, oil, uranium, timber, and water, the law adapted rapidly. Federal leasing regimes overrode the tribal objections. Liability was minimized through judicial complexity. Health harms were framed as natural, behavioral, or unproven. Statutes of limitations expire before full impacts emerge, and that's one of their biggest tricks. These statutes of limitation. Oh, we just didn't know about it. Well, sure you did. Uranium mining on Navajo land is a textbook case. Legal permission existed for extraction. Legal responsibility for long-term harm was diffused, delayed, or denied. Compensation required extraordinary proof, burdens not imposed elsewhere. This was not accidental, it was legal risk management by design. So, why do elites emphasize this? We're a country of, a nation of laws. Elites invoke law loudly for a reason. Law provides legitimacy without appearing coercive. Law obscures power relations behind protect procedure. Law shifts blame from decision makers to the system. Crucially, elites are insulated because they can hire specialized counsel. They influence regulatory draftings. They litigate strategically over decades. They lobby for exemptions, carve outs, and preemption. By contrast, Native communities historically lacked sustained legal representation. They faced language and cultural barriers. They were denied standing or jurisdiction. They had claims fragmented across agencies and courts. So the U.S. is not merely a nation of laws, it is a nation of lawyers, regulators, courts, and administrators operating within power hierarchies. And I've talked about this in the past. Originally, laws were common law. common law so the common man was equally represented. They just have been shifting this over time with all that maritime law business. And that's the same law they're using to grab up those Venezuelan oil boats. So, law does not restrain power by default. It restrains power only when power is evenly distributed. For Native Americans, power was not just unequal, it was systematically removed. Once that happened, law ceased to be a shield and became an instrument. The instrument endures because legal history is taught selectively. Harms are fragmented across time and agencies. Responsibility is diluted. Moral claims are reframed as technical disputes. Calling it the rule of law masks what it actually is, the rule of managed outcomes. So when elites say we're a nation of laws, they are often correct in the narrowest sense and profoundly misleading in meaningful one. The real question has never been whether law exists. It has always been who the law exists for. So when people hear the story of uranium mining on tribal lands, they usually think of one danger, radiation. But that's only half the story. What made uranium mining truly dangerous was not just the uranium, it was the system the government built around it. A system that cut every corner, a system that measured only the hazards it wanted to measure, a system that saved money by ignoring everything else. And here's where it gets really crazy. The mills were using purchased sulfuric acid. It did not come out of mines. So these mines created their own sulfur poisons naturally and violently, and no one bothered to monitor them. Inside those same mines, blasting heat, water, and pyrite in the rock created sulfuric acid, the mist choking and sometimes lethal. These reactions happened every single day. They were predictable. They were documented internally, and yet they were never included in the original safety story. Why not? Well, because the government designed uranium safety around one single hazard, radiation. That was the risk they understood. That was the risk they could measure. And that was the risk they could compensate. If they admitted to sulfur poisoning, acid burns, lung damage, chemical injuries, and the complex mix of gases underground, they would have had to install ventilation, slow down production, hire chemists, spend money, and eventually pay medical claims. So instead, everything got folded into one simple narrative. If miners got sick, it must be radiation. That was the first trick. The second trick was classification. Chemical issues were pushed into separate regulatory boxes. Air quality here, water quality there, sulfuric acid under the chemistry industry, blasting fumes under mining regulation. No single agency ever looked at the full picture of what miners were breathing. Yeah, this is a huge game of omission, right? The third trick was the omission. When the public records were written in the 1960s and 1970s, sulfur quietly disappeared. Acid mist vanished from the story. Blasting gases became minor irritants. Workers' complaints were described as anxiety or nonspecific, and the official record became clean, simple, and also incomplete. It required something even more common, not just a conspiracy, a system designed not to look too closely. Radiation got all the attention, sulfur got erased, miners paid the price, and tribal communities are still living with the consequences. Today, new uranium ore is once again being trucked across Navajo land. Old stories are repeating itself. So, I am going to be taking a break here and I will be back on the other side because I have quite a bit more to say here. So, hold on one second. Okay, I am back. And just to recap, all of this stuff started when the transformer showed up on my property. What happened was that I noticed on Google Maps that around August 2019, a transformer showed up and a picture was taken of my property. What I noticed was that all the streets surrounding me had much older maps on them. So what I noticed was in August of 2019, evidently when they installed the transformer on my property, they took a picture, uploaded it to Google Maps, but that was the only picture that was taken. They didn't take pictures all around my neighborhood. Probably part of the purchasing plan. And then they had to return. They returned. Now this is all in hindsight. They returned around January, February of 2020, and they needed access to my property because my property is all fenced in. So they needed access to my property to that specific electrical smart meter in the back of my house, right off my bedroom where I used to sleep. And so they had to activate something. So I know this for a fact. When they put the transformer up, they have to do something at the smart meter level to activate that transformer to your property, okay? And we also know that the US is still importing uranium from Russia. So just basically, uranium is a heavy metallic metal, very dense and radioactive. Sulfur is a non-metal element, commonly encountered as elemental sulfur or in compounds. So, is it possible that maybe they're using sulfur and maybe just a pinch of uranium? Could be, right? So anyway, so that's where that stands. so so the US is still importing uranium for some reason, and they are making the sulfur in the actual mines themselves. And also they're pulling off the sulfur from the oil refineries. So yeah, it can kind of get kind of circular. But before I keep going here, I'd like to get to the root of things. So, how did it become so easy to slur Indians? Well, they didn't have any legal rights, right? Because the lawyers made sure that happened. Well, it was very easy. Hang on a second. They used cartoons, which was actually an evil genius move. And cartoons like the Looney Tunes, and they always showed these pictures of, cartoons of Indians and cowboys. I'm sure that all the little boys wanted to be cowboys to kill the Indians, right? So it started off really in childhood. So children learned these images before learning history, the law, or even policy. So the cartoons actually became like a truth baseline for us as kids. So, and even editorial cartoons in newspapers routinely showed Native people as obstacles to progress, dirty, lazy, or backwards, and showed them as standing in the way of railroads, dams, or mines. And these images were used during debates over Indian removal, reservation confinement, and resource extraction to visually argue that displacement was reasonable and inevitable. And then, so I think the cartoons really were the most evil genius of this whole thing because they also used cartoons to sell tobacco and other food products. So, cartoon slurs, I think, were extraordinarily powerful because they also bypassed adult scrutiny, right? It normalized contempt through humor. It trained multiple generations simultaneously and it entered classrooms, homes, and textbooks. So, and this is what historians call visual common sense. Assumptions so familiar they go unquestioned. So, even after overt cartoon depictions decline, police, courts, and media retained the same mental images. Native people were still framed as unreliable, irresponsible, or invisible. Environmental and legal terms were easier to dismiss those harms because, they were those people, right? So cartoons were not accidental. They were a mass educational system that taught Americans who mattered, who belonged in the past, who could be ignored without guilt. And then there was also a very famous movie called The Scalp Hunters with Burt Lancaster. And that was really shows how cartoons slurs graduated into mainstream cinema. Extreme violence against Native people was trivialized. Stereotypes became ironic rather than questioned. It shows how deeply normalization the imagery was. So normalized it could anchor a studio comedy starring a major A-list actor. And then also slurs portraying Native people as inherently drunk, lazy, or irresponsible. Phrases implying addiction is cultural or genetic rather than policy driven. One thing you could always rely on a trauma victim to do is to try to block out that pain. And how do you do that? Well, alcohol is usually your first step. So all of this shift the blame away from federal policies, the forced relocation, the food rationing, the alcohol weaponization, the economic isolation, and onto the victims themselves. Starting to notice a pattern here? So anyway, so I also went looking for tests because I've talked a lot about the testing they did, and Bill Clinton said, "We're so sorry, we'll never do this again." Well, anyway, there were tests on mustard gas and sulfur. From World War I to World War II and extending into the 1940s, the U.S. military conducted human exposure experiments using sulfur mustard. Subjects included U.S. soldiers, prisoners, institutionalized populations. Many subjects were, of course, not fully informed of risk. Those experiments tested skin blistering thresholds, eye and lung injury, protective gear effectiveness, long-term respiratory damage. And I can't remember if I said this already. I started this segment 7 minutes ago, but um oh, I updated my picture over my website. I am looking just terrific. I should sign up for a bunch of dating sites. I've got the sulfur burn on my face is 100% sulfur. You can see how my teeth are all etched and falling. I'm quite a prize. I looked as fascinatingly beautiful. So anyway, so yeah, I did update those pictures so you can go and take a look. I would advise doing it when you have an empty stomach. I'm pretty revolting looking. So anyway, so um anyhow, so yeah, they did the test, so they know about the skin blistering thresholds and all of that. I gotta tell you, the blistering from sulfur is well, they replaced a I had a triple ankle fracture years ago because the pills made my bones weak. And so then a few years ago, they had actually, when they did the surgery several years ago, they put in a plate and screws into my foot. Well, the plate and the screws in my foot came loose in the last 4 or 5 years. So I walk with a very, very distinct limp. But actually, using the pain process that I'm using, I don't feel any pain in my ankle unless I run out of my pain medicine. But I do feel that pain on my face, and it is constant and intense. You really feel like just screaming. So a lot of sadism involved in this, right? Just to with intent do this to people. But anyway, so they did these people they tested these people, of course, without consent. They're always prisoners and military and all that. So, and this is all well documented. This was documented in Department of Defense archives, VA investigations, national academic reports, and later congressional inquiries. So the U.S. formally acknowledged these experiments in the 1990s, parallel to, but legally separate from the radiation apology. And what made those different? Well, They were framed as chemical warfare tests, not public health or environmental exposure studies. So, sulfur dioxide and acid aerosol exposure studies were less known but real, and they were between the 1930s and the 1960s. U.S. researchers conducted controlled exposure studies involving sulfur dioxide, acid aerosols, smog mixtures. So you can't tell me they were testing because then they knew what to do against those native Indians in those mines, right? So all that stuff was getting tested, right? So subjects included, of course, volunteers, workers, and occasionally institutionalized populations. Yeah, of course, of course. So these studies examined lung function decline, bronchoconstriction, eye and mucous membrane damage, exasperation of asthma and chronic bronchitis. And you remember they started, they turned down claims of people. They told them, oh, no, you've got asthma. You don't have anything that has to do with this mine. So, clinically, what they did, they labeled these mustard gas or sulfur tests as air pollution research or industrial hygiene or occupational exposure studies, not human experimentation in the later ethical sense. Okay. So that was how it was classified. So as a result, they did not trigger the same reckoning as the radiation experiments. They were considered acceptable under pre Belmont ethics standards. So, so they never got the Clinton apology. So radiation was centralized, sulfur was diffused. And here's how they sliced and diced it. Radiation experiments were run by the AEC, the DOE, and the military nuclear programs. Sulfur exposures were spread across Army chemical units, industrial labs, public health agencies, and universities. So no single authority owned the harm. Clever, right? How just slice and dice it up. So sulfur was then classified as conventional, not exceptional. Radiation was new, invisible, exotic, tied to weapons of mass destruction. Sulfur compounds were already industrially ubiquitous, framed as irritants, not existential hazards, treated as dose management problems, not moral crises. So that framing suppressed ethical escalation. So radiation injuries fell under Special Compensation Acts. Chemical injuries fell under workers' comp, tort law, and VA claims. So once sulfur was routed into ordinary liability channels, it lost its political gravity. Instead, you find fragmented studies, military chemical testing, industrial exposure research, occupational health experiments judged acceptable at the time. The harm is real, but administratively normalized. So, why does this intersect with uranium? In uranium mining and milling, sulfuric acid use, there was also acid mist exposure and also SO2 emissions. And those were treated as known industrial hazards, not experimental exposures, not compensatable under nuclear frameworks. So even when people were effectively exposed without consent, it was not labeled experimentation. And this label choice mattered. So the U.S. did conduct human experiments involving sulfur compounds. The most explicit were sulfur mustard tests on soldiers and others. Sulfur dioxide and acid aerosol exposure studies also occurred. These did not trigger a national apology because they were fragmented. They were classified as conventional hazards. They fell outside the nuclear ethics reckoning. Boy, those lawyers really come in handy, don't they? Radiation became a scandal because it was exceptionalized. Sulfur was normalized. That difference shaped how history remembers and what it quietly absorbs. So, I'm not trying to say that every illness is caused by this, but I am saying that sulfur exposure has been underestimated, misnamed. I did a whole show about it previous to this show. If you haven't watched the previous show, you'll be lost. But anyway, so yeah, all of these tests proved that what they were going to be doing to those native Indians was going to become reality, right? So but near refineries, power plants, mills, mining zones, or heavy industry, people don't just get one illness, they get many at once. These symptoms often look like anxiety, radiation exposure, or mysterious chronic illnesses. And they cross so many systems in the body, people are told it's all in their heads. So, I want to peel back a little bit of the cover of what actually happened with the native Indians. They didn't stop fighting back because they were defeated. They stopped to stop the killing. Killing is really a joke in this country. People run around saying, "Oh, they're trying to kill me. Oh, ha 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 ha. He got killed. Oh, ha 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 ha. They probably killed him. Oh, the Clintons, they kill everybody." Yeah, I think that personally, stop treating it like a joke, okay? Because frankly, when you're the one being killed like I am, it loses a lot of its humor, okay? And it loses a lot of its sensitivity toward others. I see all these big people when I'm cruising around. They have millions of subscribers. They actually have the nerve to start whole channels and say, "I'm being shadow banned. Please help me out." Well, they never stop to consider that maybe people just don't like your content anymore. Maybe they're too busy to listen to you, you big freaks. But their first response is, "They're going to kill me or I'm being shadow banned." But yet, when they're killing people like myself, nobody registers, right? They look at my feed over on YouTube, think, "Wow, she doesn't get many many views. She's got to be a pretty bad person, right?" How can somebody only have 30 views 30 views on something talking about vitamin D? Well, because that's what shadow banning is. But they never stop and they think. They actually help these people. They say, "Yeah, that's really too bad. We don't want you shadow banned. We'll go and make comments. We'll help you out." Well, I've never had that kind of help. Nobody wants to help me except for a couple of people. So next time you walk around saying things like, "They're going to kill us," remember, there's actual people out here who are being, in fact, killed. It becomes a little bit offensive after a while, right? So let me tell you about the native Indians. So they didn't stop because they were defeated. They stopped to stop the killing. And this has all been documented. Many native leaders said openly that continuing to fight meant genocide, not just war. U.S. military tactics at the time targeted whole villages, not just warriors, becoming burning their food stores, killing women and children, destroying homes, poisoning or killing the buffalo, forced relocations in winter. A number of the Indian chiefs said some version of the same truth. If we fight, our people die. If we stop, maybe our children will live. That's not surrender. That's a decision to save whoever was left. Chief Joseph said after months of fighting and losing many women and children to cold and starvation, he said, "It is cold and we have no blankets. My people, some of them have run away to the hills and have no food. I will fight no more forever." That wasn't surrender out of weakness. It was a plea to save the remaining families. Sitting Bull in the Lakotas, he repeated that the U.S. government's violence targeted families, not warriors. When he fled to Canada, he said it was to stop his people from being killed. Plenty comps, the Crow Indians. He explained that resistance would lead to complete destruction, and the future of their children required a new strategy. The Comanche leader said, when the buffalo were wiped out by the government to starve the tribes, Parker said continuing war would bring only the death of our mothers and children. The real history, Native nations did not just stop fighting. They made the most powerful strategic choice possible. They stopped because the U.S. military deliberately shifted to extermination tactics, and tribal leaders realized that continued resistance meant the literal end of their very own people. So, stopping the fighting did not bring peace. It brought a different kind of war, slow destruction, forced relocation to poor land, federal food rations used as control, mission schools that erase language and culture, outlawing of ceremonies, children taken to boarding schools, widespread malnutrition and disease, dependency enforced by policy, no legal sovereignty in practice, and that is what did it in. Those lawyers. Uranium mining layered radiation exposure on top of already broken communities. That is where the second betrayal occurred. On lands abandoned by white settlers as too poor, the richest uranium deposits in the U.S. were found. Mining companies moved in. Native workers were hired without warnings. Dust inhaled daily. Water contamination. Houses built from radioactive tailings. No protection, no monitoring, no informed consent. People who had already chosen survival or overextension were now told this is safe work. It was not. Leukemia, lung cancer, kidney failure, birth defects all skyrocketed. Native nations did not give up. They made the most brutal strategic choice any society can face. Stop the war to a fragment of the people so a fragment of the people might survive. Then the surviving fragment of people were economically caged in, culturally attacked, medically neglected, and later radiologically poisoned. So native leaders didn't stop fighting because they were beaten. They stopped because the U.S. switched from war against warriors to war against families and their clear choice of survival over heroic extension. I started looking further. On native lands alone, there are more than 500, yes, 500 abandoned uranium mines. The contamination of soil, water, and homes, plus elevated rates of cancers, kidney disease, and other issues continue to affect communities today. Many households still lack access to public water systems. Some rely on hauling water from unregulated sources, which raises the risk of exposure to uranium and arsenic contamination. Uranium was deliberately found, developed, and then abandoned on tribal lands, not accidentally discovered and then ignored. Reservations ended up with a disproportionate concentration of uranium sites because of how U.S. law, geology, and the Cold War policy intersected. Tribal lands contain a disproportionately high share of U.S. uranium mines relative to their land area population. So they claim there's 500 to 523 abandoned uranium mines alone. It is the largest concentration in the entire United States. It affects all of the native tribes. Tribal land represents a small fraction of U.S. land, yet it hosts a very large fraction of historical uranium extraction sites. This is not a coincidence. Uranium bearing sandstone formations exist in Colorado Plateau, Four Corners regions, and Black Hills. These formations do overlap with tribal lands, but geology alone does not explain the pattern. It was the federal control over surface rights. On many reservations, the federal government controlled mineral leasing, and I have talked about this extensively. Know your rights. Do you know if your property includes above land or below land? You need to know these things. If you don't have below land leasing, those trucks could one day haul up onto your property and start digging for oil. I'm not joking here. So what happened? How'd they control it? Well, the federal government controlled mineral leasing. Tribal consent was limited or poorly informed. Royalties were minimal. Environmental liability was effectively ignored. This made tribal lands cheap, fast, and politically safe for extraction. So during the Manhattan Project and early Cold War, uranium was treated as a strategic military resource. The Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC, guaranteed buyers, paid bonuses for production speed, ignored worker safety and environmental impact. Reservations were ideal. They had no powerful local governments. They had limited legal recourse. Workers could be hired without OSHA style protection, which didn't exist anyways. So, did they stop looking after they found uranium on Indian territory? Well, sort of. They extracted intensively, then abandoned sites once the strategic need declined. 1944 to 62, aggressive mining and milling. 1960 to 1970s, declining prices, partial shutdowns. 1980s, industry collapses. And after the collapse, the companies simply walked away. What stopped was cleanup, not extraction. So, why weren't these sites cleaned up? Well, mining companies dissolved or restructured. Liability shifted between private firms, the AEC, and the Department of Energy. Tribal land fell into a regulatory gray zone. Cleanup costs exceeded any remaining economic value. So mines were sealed poorly or not at all. Tailings were left exposed. Homes built with contaminated material are still there. The water sources are all polluted. Was this pattern unique to uranium? No, but uranium was the most extreme case. Similar patterns occurred with coal, oil and gas, and rare earths. Uranium stands out because it was tied to nuclear weapons. The health effects were delayed and deniable. National security secrecy suppressed scrutiny. So, uranium wasn't incidentally found on reservations. Tribal lands were actively targeted for uranium mining. Extraction was intense, fast, and poorly regulated. When the Cold War urgency failed, the sites were abandoned. Cleanup and health consequences were left to the tribes. That is why they appear to have the most uranium, not because others were spared, but because they were used and then left behind. So, uranium absolutely could be and was found in areas where more white, non tribal populations lived. The difference is not discovery, it is how far extraction was allowed to go, how it was regulated, and what happened afterwards. So, uranium was found widely across the United States. Uranium deposits exist in many regions with predominantly white populations, including Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Texas, South Dakota, Washington, Pennsylvania, and the Appalachians, New Mexico. Geographically, uranium is not rare and not confined to tribal lands, but the key difference was not looking. It was exploitation thresholds in white majority areas. Mining faced state regulation. Local governments could block permits, demand cleanup, and sue operators. Property owners had clear mineral rights, stronger access to courts. Media scrutiny was higher. Political backlash was faster. So fewer abandoned mines in the white territory, better remediations, earlier shutdowns, less residential exposure. In tribal areas, federal leasing overrode local objections. Workers lacked any protections. Environmental damage accumulated. Abandonment carried little consequence. From a Cold War extraction standpoint, tribal lands were cheaper, faster, politically quieter, legally framed, less likely to produce lawsuits. That is why the same ore bodies extending across reservation boundaries were often heavily mined on tribal land, minimally mined or quickly closed off reservations. Mining firms walked away from tribal sites but cleaned up elsewhere. Tailings were left exposed near homes on reservations but fenced off elsewhere. Housing built with mine waste occurred overwhelmingly in tribal communities. Federal agencies delayed acknowledging harm for decades. If uranium was too dangerous to mine near white towns, that risk logic should have applied everywhere. It did not. So, uranium exists in many places across the U.S. It is not uniquely abundant on reservations. When mining became inconvenient or expensive, those lands were abandoned. So, if anyone had wanted to accept the same risks, costs, or consequences, uranium could have been mined in many more white majority areas. Groups such as, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this discrimination now. So, groups such as Jews and Romas, often called gypsies in historical texts, have faced recurrent waves of persecutions. Indigenous people is what it, excuse me, indigenous people in what is now the United States experienced something similarly different, structurally different. It was immediate conquest, permanent disposition, continuous legal subjugation, ongoing administrative control. From first contact forward, the pressure never lifted. There was no post persecution normalization. For Native nations, oppression did not arrive later as a policy shift. It began at first sustained contact and hardened over time. Land seizure as a founding premise. Treaties made and broken as routine practice. Forced removals, often multiple times per tribe. Military campaigns against civilians, not just combatants. Deliberate destruction of food systems and livelihoods. Confinement to reservations under federal authority. This was not marginalizations at the edge of society. It was the structure of the society being built. What makes the indigenous case distinct is the depth of legalized control. Tribes were defined as domestic dependent nations. Congress asserting plenary power over native lives. Federal control of land, mineral, water, and movement. Boarding schools designed to explicitly erase language and culture. Religious practices were criminalized well into the 20th century. This is opposition embedded in stature, not just prejudice or mob violence. They were never provided with an off ramp. Other persecuted groups over time could sometimes assimilate, emigrate, enter the legal mainstream, build parallel economic power. Native nations were denied these exits. They could not leave without losing identity and land. They could not fully assimilate without legal erasure. They could not defend territory without being labeled hostile. They could not refuse federal control without punishments. The system allowed survival, but not sovereignty. Uranium mining, dams, pipelines, waste disposal, and military use of tribal land are not anomalies. They follow the same logic. Federal authority overrides local consent. Economic need is exploited. Environmental and health costs are externalized. Accountability is delayed or denied. Different century, same power relationships. So, Native people in the U.S. have lived with a continuous boot, not intermittent persecution, not because they were uniquely weak, but because the country was built on their land. Their legal status was engineered to be subordinate. Their resistance was framed as illegitimate from the onset. Their suffering was administratively normalized. This did not diminish the suffering of Jews, Romas, and others. It highlights that indigenous expression in the U.S. was foundational, permanent, and bureaucratic, not episodic. And who are the people behind our modern speech? Modern speech enforcement is reactive to recent trauma, not long histories. Search engines, platforms, and institutions are highly sensitive to groups whose persecution is recent, internationally codified, legally memorialized, widely litigated, explicitly named to post World War II human rights frameworks. As a result, speech targeting Jews or Romas trigger fast intervention because the Holocaust and pogroms are central references points in modern hate speech law. There is strong institutional memory, advocacy, infrastructure, and legal precedent. Corporations have clear compliance incentives. This does not reflect moral hierarchy, it reflects bureaucratic memory. So, indigenous people fall into a different, older category. They are foundational victims. Native nations in the U.S. occupy a paradoxical position. Their disposition is foundational to the state itself. Their oppression predates modern human rights law. Their suffering is embedded in treaties, statutes, and federal doctrine. There was no single globally recognized event that closed the chapter. As a result, harm is normalized as historical. Language survives that would be unacceptable elsewhere. Slurs and stereotypes persist with less institutional response. Not because the harm is smaller, but because it is older and unresolved. That allows you to slur the Indians, but not the gypsies or the Jews, right? Just keep that straight. Because indigenous people are framed as a domestic issue, not an international one. U.S. law treats tribes as managed populations, not protected minorities. There is no equivalent to post war tribunals or global reckoning. Cl- Corporate risk calculations prioritize global backlash over internal contradictions. To put it plainly, protecting native dignity forces institutions to confront the country's own origin story. That is avoided whenever possible. This is not about permission to insult anyone. It is important to be explicit here. Harmful language toward any group is wrong. The goal is not equal opportunity to demean other people. The goal is to recognize equality. The goal is to equal recognition of harm and protection from it. Some groups are shielded by modern legal memory. Indigenous people are trapped in an older category of what's called settled history. That makes their suffering easier to minimize and their dignity easier to violate. This is a structural failure. It is not an accident. People live through disrespect. People live through disrespect. So at the top of the stack are technology companies, search engines, social platforms, their legal departments, their trust and safety and policy teams, their advertisers and insurers. These actors design rules to minimize legal liability, regulatory scrutiny, advertiser withdrawals, international backlash, and reputational risk. The guiding question is not what is historically fair, it is what creates risk for us right now. So, modern speech enforcement is heavily shaped by Holocaust era precedent, genocide convention language, EU hate speech law, U.S. civil rights frameworks, anti discrimination statutes tied to specific protective classes, groups explicitly named and litigated within these frameworks receive automatic institutional sensitivity. Indigenous people in the U.S. largely fall outside of this architecture because their disposition predates these laws. Their oppression is legally embedded in U.S. governance. There was no international tribunal or settlement process. This is a legal classification problem, not a moral one. So then speech protections get reinforced by well funded advocacy groups, local NGOs, international watchdogs, rapid response media networks. These groups are the ones who monitor platforms, flag violations, generate public pressure, and create legal exposure. Native nations generally lack comparable funding, centralization of advocacy infrastructure, global media leverage, a single unifying event frame. As a result, enforcement is uneven. So, where historians do fit indirectly, historians influence academic discourse, education, long term cultural understanding, what is considered settled history. But historians do not set platform rules. They do not write moderation policies. They do not enforce speech standards. They do not control corporate algorithms. In fact, many historians have documented indigenous oppression extensively. Their work simply does not translate into enforcement mechanisms. So, why is indigenous harm is treated so differently? Because acknowledging it would further require institutions to admit the nation's founding involved systematic disposition. The legal system still rests on that outcome. The harm was not accidental or temporary. It never truly ended. That is a destabilizing admission for state and corporate actors. So the system quietly categorizes indigenous sufferings as historical, complex, contextual, unresolved, which in practice means less protection and less urgency. These rules are made by corporate and legal risk systems, not historians. They prioritize recent internationally codified trauma. Indigenous people fall into a structural blind spot. The result is unequal protection. So, the decision is not about slurs, they say, it's about risk exposure. They're worried about lawsuits and all of that. Well, yeah, that's what they're always worried about, right? But this all boils back to control, right? And lawyers shape rules by narrowing liability, not by endorsing harm. Well, indirectly they are, but I'm not going to go down that hole right this second. So, corporate lawyers define protective categories based on statute, align policies with existing case law. avoid ambiguous areas that invite challenge. If a category is poorly defined in law, jurisdictionally complex, and tied to a state's own founding practices, it is more likely to be treated cautiously or inadequately. This is especially true for indigenous people in the U.S. whose legal status is unique and unresolved. That's a category it fits under. So let me scroll down here about for a second. I need to move beyond these Native and Indians and lawyers and all this stuff. So it was all how they sliced and diced all this stuff up. Um, and one thing, if you would take the time to read my book, and I've offered it for free, it's over my website. One thing that psychopaths must have is control. And who amplifies these lawyers? Well, the NGOs. They select cases with legal viability. They frame narratives around litigible facts. They emphasize timelines that hit modern law. They focus on harms that map cleanly onto civil rights statutes. So it's really cooked up between those lawyers and the NGOs. From the beginning, tribes were treated as wards, not rights bearing equals. Federal law asserted plenary power over them. Treaty violations were normalized, not punished. Well, they broke every one of them. So yeah, every treaty the U.S. wrote, they broke. And how they got this reputation as a safe haven right now, geez, don't even get me started because, well, I got to keep moving. But anyway, so yes, Native nations did not have teams of attorneys helping shape doctrine. So yeah, everything was already done. What are the attorneys going to do to help them, right? The attorneys were part of the reason they ended up how they did. Lawyers and NGOs do not decide moral worth. Well, I disagree with that completely, but they supposedly decide what harm can be enforced. Indigenous people entering the legal system after the damage was done. Their suffering was time based, jurisdictional fragmented, and normalized. That left them unprotected compared to groups whose harms aligned with modern law. So yeah, it's and what they do about the Indians? Well, they actually they treat them like they're a bunch of drunken lunatics, right? Oh, you know those Indians are over there drunk. They don't know what in the hell they're doing over there. They kind of deserve to live on those reservations. Well, if you would be sensitive to the trauma of people, I think if you were beaten, mauled over, and pushed aside your entire cultural life, yeah, you might imbibe in a lot of alcohol to block out that horrific trauma that is untreated. And get this, alcohol was deliberately introduced into many native communities during early contact and trade. So traditional economies were systematically destroyed. So, yeah, they actually are the ones who introduced alcohol that they can now blame on the Indian people, right? When you remove land, food systems, autonomy, and cultural continuity, pathology follows. It's a predictable outcome. So, yeah, but by setting these images through cartoons and books and everything else, it justified the underfunding. It rationalizes neglect. It reframes treaty violations as charity. It converts legal obligation into personal occupational aid. It silences discussions of restitution or repair. It turns structural violence into personal blame. Always got to blame those victims, right? So, native communities with strong governance, low addiction rates, and economic stress. Let me see. I got to scroll down here. Yeah. In effect, history is laundered into background, and present suffering is framed as choice. So yeah, that they really. I'm going to keep moving along here, but yeah, I have a lot more information on my website as far as the mines that are still over there now. Now they're saying that They're not mining on Indian property, but I don't have the ability to dig into it completely, but here's what I do know. They're skirting the edges, okay? They're still using trucks to cross through Indian territory with uranium and stuff. So right now they're skirting the energy. And what I would have to say to you is this: put all of these things aside. If you see the native people are trying to have some sort of events where they're trying to protest this, join them. Stop ignoring them. Join them. Walk hand in hand. We deserve something for these people. They deserve our solidarity, not our shame or our blame. I got to take a break here. Hey, I am back. I started this recording, a week or so ago, and then I had to take some time off to have a little sulfur attack. At this stage of my existence, my plan is to finish up and report on some files that I've been working on for a very long time. So my goal for today is to wrap up this sulfur business. Sulfur is actually insane what it does to our bodies. Everything from sugar to alcohol, it has an endless amount of harm that it does to us. And also, remember, this all got started because my house has been targeted and they set up transformers, which the one transformer connects directly to the smart meter on my property. And then they came back a few years later and I've recorded all of this, every bit of this. You want to hear it all? Just go listen to my shows. Anyhow, so then they came back a couple of years later when I wasn't quiet and they installed transformers all around my entire property. All of this I have documented. I actually have original paperwork showing the transformers. So none of this I'm guessing at. None of this is coming from my own mind. It has all been documented. And everything I'm going to be telling you today, I have documented it all, every last bit of it. So these transformers, pretty problematic. And what happens with transformers is they heat up while sending power, and heat and sulfur is deadly. And they generate heat even when they're idle. And heat increases with electrical load. So, yeah, we have a lot coming into our homes right now. This is the cold civil war. This is a silent war. They're attacking us in our homes right now. And this is how it works. How it works with the smart meters is this, is that what happens once the smart meters started being installed, and the United States is about 85% installed on smart meters right now. That's not to say if you don't have a smart meter, you're not being impacted. It's just that a smart meter and these transformers accelerate things. Because what happens with those smart meters is that it reduces safety margins. It loads transformers closer to nameplate capacity. It stretches existing infrastructures instead of upgrading it. And so places run hotter for longer periods thanks to those transformers. So transformers heat scales up with current, not voltage. So when smart meters enable peak shaving, demand exposure, and load shifting, the result is longer periods of elevated current, sustained copper losses, higher average transformer temperatures. And this is exactly why they want you out looking at those chemtrails. Oh, look in the sky, look in the sky. The danger is inside of our homes. And the heat output increases even if total energy use stays the same. This has been all stacked. This is about eugenics. So anyway, so I have all the information about these smart meters and stuff, everything you ever want to know about this over on my website. So this is important to know. Smart meters are central, even if they're small. Smart meters matter because they close the feedback loop. They make every watt accountable. They enable infrastructure to run closer to limits. They turn the grid from build for uncertainty into operate at the edge of certainty. Heat is the physical consequence, and with sulfur, you do not want heat. And before I get started, I've talked a lot about the law and things in previous segments to this, how the law was really rigged to make all this happen to the native Indians and whatnot. Lately in the news, there's been a lot of things about ISIS. The Bondi Beach deal in Sydney is being blamed on the Islamic State ISIS. Keep in mind, they're also now saying that this is the crazy part 25,000 Americans are saved for every ship the U.S. government blasts out of the water over in Argentina, that area. So yeah, they're actually calculating. They want to save us, right? They're claiming that they're murdering people in other countries, not to steal their oil, but because they're saving our lives. And they claim that 25,000 of us will live for every boat they blast out of the water. I call BS. Our lives are being threatened inside of our own homes. They have been shipping drugs to us endlessly forever. Doctors line up with prescriptions to give us drugs. We don't need to blow up ships to save Americans. And all these attacks at Bondi Beach, that is all ISIS. They're talking about in Nigeria. They're talking about ISIS in Nigeria going over there. They say ISIS has been killing innocent Christians. Well, last time I checked, Nigeria is a pretty black country, so I suspect ISIS is now in Nigeria because this is a kill box. They're over there to kill people, so they blame it on ISIS. Whenever you read ISIS, think of the U.S., think of the war machine. ISIS was considered the great of magic with the power to bring the dead back to life. The pyramid texts repeatedly mention her, like inside Una's pyramid, the king, now Osiris, directly addresses her. ISIS, these people love ISIS. So they use the name ISIS because ISIS is the god of all gods. This is about the God deal, right? This is about Satanism and gods. So one definition I didn't talk about earlier, but I've talked about endlessly, but for context, I want to put it here. This is all about people thinking they want to rule us because they're the gods. No more clear than in their own name, elites. El is a Hebrew word meaning God. The first word translated as God in the Hebrew scripture is Elohim, a word that is grammatically plural and can be translated as gods. Genesis chapter 1 opens with this line: In the beginning, God, Elohim, created the heavens and the earth. And a few verses later, they talk about then God, Elohim said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. The language is plural, us, our. This has been debated supposedly for thousands of years. Scholars explain it in different ways: divine council language, royal speech, or layered authorship. But the wording itself is clear, it is plural. Many Hebrew names also contain the word El, directly referencing God. Elijah, Elisha, Samuel. These names are built around the idea of divine authority. The same chapter of Genesis then assigns humans a role. Let them rule over the earth, it says. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over living creature. The words are direct: rule, subdue, dominate. Throughout history, people at the top have often used religious or sacred language to make their power seem natural, deserved, and unquestionable. Instead of saying, we rule because we are stronger, richer, or more ruthless, they use words like, we rule because it is God's will. We were chosen. This is the natural order of things. And when power is framed this way, hierarchy stops looking like a human decision and starts looking like something built into the universe itself. And here's where it works in practice: hierarchy becomes, well, just the way things are, not something people created. Taking land, labor, or resources becomes stewardship, civilization, or progress. Control and coercion are reframed as order, discipline, or law. Violence does not disappear, it is rebranded. When harm happens, it is described as necessary, unfortunate, or for the greater good. This is where the danger lies. The danger is not that powerful people literally believe they are gods. The danger is that they behave as if accountability does not apply to them. When leaders believe rules are for others, when suffering is acceptable if it serves order, when consequences do not move upward, exploitation becomes routine and abuse becomes invisible. Some writers claim that a very small global elite believes it is descended from gods or divinely chosen to rule over the earth and all life on it. These claims are ideological, not established in historical fact. What is well documented is something simpler and more consistent across history. Ruling classes repeatedly adopt sacred or cosmic language to justify dominance, whether or not they believe it literally. The core idea is this: sacred language has been used as a shield, not to create mortality, but to excuse power from it. Or, put it more simply, power is more dangerous when it convinces itself it does not need to answer to anyone. So let's take a look at all this sulfur business. When I started going through this file, what I did was I don't like to bury the lead, so I moved the most important things to the top. Some things you should be watching for. They use sulfur in our food. Sulfites can be used as food preservatives in many categories. But in the US, they're not permitted on certain fresh foods intended to be eaten raw, like fresh fruits and vegetables. In most countries, sulfites added must be declared on food labels. I don't believe that. I believe that this is a lawless society we're in right now. I wouldn't rely on those labels. The only reason that I have been alive for all these years is I have followed my instincts 100 full stop from the very beginning, and I've recorded it all. In the very beginning, my first instinct was get air in this house, so I installed fans at all of my windows. I hope you're hearing me very clearly. Get those fans in your windows. They're very easy to install. Box fans are very cheap. Use use wire that you use for hanging pictures, but just use the 20-pound wire. They're very easy to hang in your windows. Get that air moving inside of your space. I also, at that time, I was already on a really decent diet to begin with, but I've only been eating like single source foods, no sugar added, and you'll see more about this later. All of my instincts have served me well. Follow your own instincts. That is why they want everybody thinking, well, this life is it. Do it in this life or you're out. They want you to not understand reincarnation because it makes you easier to control and manage. So learn to look for yourself. Be your own detective. Stop relying on people who are obviously out to get the rest of us. Learn to read those labels. What goes into your body matters. If you want to keep your time going on this game board that we're on before you head home, well, I would suggest you take a look at your diet and all these other things, but I'm not going to nag you about anything. All of this is completely up to you because I am concerned there's still sulfites in baby foods, okay? There's obviously going to be sulfites in all those dried foods they're giving babies and stuff. But what I'm saying is I think they're intentionally adding them, but I can't prove it. But I think everybody needs to looky for themselves. So let's talk about the sulfur and the sugar issue. Sulfur is not inherently bad. It is required for glutathione, the primary antioxidant, detox enzymes, phase 2 sulfation, structural proteins, keratin and collagen, neurotransmitter regulation. Sulfur enters the body mainly through amino acids, not elemental sulfur. So, how does sugar impact? Well, it has a horrific, and I'm talking horrific impact. High sugar intake depletes the glutathione. It increases oxidative stress. It burns the liver where sulfur detoxification occurs. It disrupts the sulfation capacity, which is a key detox pathway. When the sulfation is impaired, sulfur compounds, including sulfur dioxide, sulfites, industrial sulfur derivatives, are handled poorly, leading to headaches, neurological symptoms, fatigue, cardiovascular stress. This is extraordinarily well documented. Sulfites plus sugar, higher inflammatory load. Many processed foods combine added sugar and sulfites are used as a main preservative. Did you hear me? Added sugars and sulfites are used as preservatives. So anything on that shelf that is stable is something that no one should be eating. That is not considered single source food by any means. It is processed foods. And that combination increases histamine release, worsens vascular inflammation, triggers neurological symptoms in sensitive individuals, can exacerbate heart rhythm issues. This is why sulfite sensitivity often overlaps with anxiety diagnosis, asthma, migraine headaches, idiopathic neurological complaints. But sugar does not chemically bind sulfur in the body in a protective way. Some people say, well, sugar soaks up or neutralizes sulfur. That is completely not correct. Learn to look for yourself. Sugar increases metabolic demand. Sulfur detox requires energy and antioxidants. Excess sugar steals both of them. So sugar often makes sulfur toxicity worse, not better. In populations exposed to industrial sulfur compounds, those mines, the mills, refineries, diets high in cheap sugar, the commodity food systems, poor access to protein and micronutrients, chronic stress and liver burden create the perfect storm. This can plausibly contribute to cardiovascular disease, neurological damage, fatigue syndromes, symptom often labeled psychiatric. Without visible burns or acute poisoning, this pattern is very, very easy for them to misclassify. So, because sulfur stress plus sugar driven dysfunction can present as anxiety. Where are we getting all these anxious people from in this country? Depression, cognitive impairment, irritability, sleep disturbance, which historically have been treated psychiatrically, separated from environmental cause, labeled as behavioral or lifestyle issues, rather than toxic metabolic injury. Sulfur is necessary but dangerous in excess or industrial form. Sugar weakens the body's ability to produce sulfur. High sugar intake amplifies sulfur related harm. This interaction can contribute to chronic disease and neurological symptoms. It fits a pattern where environmental injury is mistaken for mental illness. And if you think you've escaped all of this and say, I'm way ahead of this game, I haven't been having added sugar, I've been doing the zero sugar. Well, they got you in the biggest trap ever. I have another show about sugar I'll come back to. Sugar in the Gilded Age was very, very well. There are a lot of problems with it, but let me focus today on sugar and sulfur. The zero sugar business is incredible to me. I watch a whole bunch of these shopping shows on YouTube, people that go around Costco and different stores and shop for food and stuff and show what they're buying. Well, everybody says the same thing. Oh, look, they just got in some new things. And look, it's gluten free. But nobody mentions the sugar, right? And they show packages of like protein bars that have like chocolate chips in them. They go, oh, look, no sugar. And I'm thinking, has everybody gone insane? Are people really now believing that you can have chocolate chips in your protein bars and you're not eating sugar? Just like the same people that believe that electrical vehicles are good for the environment, they don't understand where electricity comes from. Yeah, that's the crowd we're hanging out with. So remember this, zero sugar is also a huge, huge trick. Zero sugar often worsens the same metabolical and neurological pathways that sugar does, while adding new problems by disrupting the insulin signaling, by confusing gut brain metabolism, by increasing oxidative stress, by interfering with sulfur detox and neurotransmitter balance. So while calories drop, psychological stress often rises. Why zero sugar is not metabolically neutral. Artificial sweeteners trigger insulin anyway. And there's some really crazy people out there. When I did the show about sugar, I talked about that girl called she's calling herself the glucose goddess. Talk about a little liar, okay? She has been pushing this idea how to eat sugar more carefully. If anybody would look into her past, the glucose goddess is a complete trickster. She's like, "Oh, I'm just a French microbiologist." Yeah, yeah, yeah. She actually was trained in the Jesuit school. She went to, let me see, the Jesuit school in Washington, Georgetown. Yeah, she graduated from Georgetown. Where'd she start her career? 23 and Me. You know, the, the people, the people that did those DNA kits. Yeah, that's where she started out. Total liar from start to finish. They're trying to keep you in the sugar game, and this is why. This is exactly why we're surrounded by liars and people who want to keep you in the game. And yeah, people will say, "Yeah, well, she's telling me how I can eat some sugar, so I don't need to stop eating sugar. I just need to eat it more carefully." That is all complete BS. That little French girl is a full stop liar, okay? I'm surprised no one has sued her pants off. She claims that she's selling these vitamins that help your sugar spikes. She is such a liar. I don't even want to get started. Okay, so let's get going back here. So the sugar, zero sugar damages your gut bacteria. That's why they want you constantly eating snacks and drinking beverages. Hey, eat these chips. Look, they have protein in them. Oh, look, this new soda that came out with is better than Pepsi and it has protein. They just want to keep you in the game. It alters your gut microbiota. You don't want to be drinking beverages nonstop all day long. You want to be drinking like lemon water in periods. If you keep flushing fluids and food in you, you're destroying your own bacteria. So it alters your gut microbiota. It reduces short chain fatty acid production. It increases gut permeability, and you get that leaky gut from that zero sugar. The gut is central to sulfur metabolism. Diabetes worsens neuroinflammation. Gut damage feeds anxiety and cognitive symptoms. This is not fringe science. This is actually replicated in a lot of places. All you have to do is know how to ask the right questions, and it is all at your fingertips. Just avoid the little French liars. So, zero sugar also increases oxidative stress, increases reactive oxygen species, impairs mitochondrial signaling, stress liver detox pathway. Hey, I think you better put down that cookie you're snacking on now. This is not looking good. This is not looking good. So, this is critical in sulfur exposure context because sulfur detox requires glutamine. Artificial sweeteners lower glutamine availability. The detox bottleneck worsens. So, zero sugar can amplify sulfur toxicity, not reduce the harm. Sulfur detox relies heavily on liver function, sulfation pathways, and glutathione availability. Both high sugar and zero sugar diets impair sulfation, disrupt your neurotransmitters like your dopamine and your serotonin, increase anxiety like symptoms. Different routes, same endpoint. This is why populations exposed to industrial toxins often show high diet soda consumption, high anxiety and neurological symptoms, low diagnostic clarity. So, zero sugar is a corporate fix, not a health fix. Zero sugar was designed to preserve sweetness addiction, maintain ultra processed food systems, avoid addressing metabolic root causes. It treats calories as a problem when the real issues are insulin signaling, liver detox load, micronutrient depletion, chronic chemical exposure. So, both of them lead to all of these things: anxiety, irritability, brain fog, sleep disturbance, heart rhythmia. Boy, sign me up. Sign me up. And these get labeled as psychiatric, treated with meds, and everything separates from the desire, from the from the diet, which mirrors the industrial misattribution pattern that I've been documenting for you right now. Sugar is a problem. Zero sugar is not the fix. Both stress the same systems in different ways. In sulfur exposed populations, zero sugar can make outcomes far worse. The real fix is metabolic stability, like single source foods, not sweetness engineering. So, historically, sulfur was studied as an acute toxin. Radiation was studied as an invisible hazard. Sugar was treated as nutritionally irrelevant unless diabetes appeared. So, when chronic illnesses emerged, sugar's amplifying role was never evaluated. Well, I would say because this is part of the trick, right? It's all on purpose. Detox failure was misattributed. Long term neurological and cardiac symptoms were reframed. Psychiatric diagnosis filled this gap. This is a structural omission, and I keep saying this is about omission, right? What they did not study is a critical omission. Early medicine did not study alcohol and sulfur exposure, alcohol and heavy metals, alcohol and radiation, alcohol and chronic heat stress. Yet today, we know alcohol depletes the glutathione, damages the liver detox capacity, increases oxidative stress, sensitizes tissues to toxins, measuring, meaning alcohol amplifies industrial injury rather than replacing it. So, yes, alcohol, why alcohol was useful to institutions. Alcohol had four features industry found convenient. It is a voluntary behavior, and that shifts responsibility to the worker. Alcohol has cultural stigma, and that weakens the credibility. Alcohol symptoms overlap, and they mimic toxic exposure effects. Alcohol has a legal utility, easy claim denial because anybody legally can buy alcohol, right? This was especially true in mining communities, reservation economies, industrial labor camps, and military populations. And how this fed misdiagnosis: alcohol plus sulfur exposure can produce heart rhythm problems, neurological damage, anxiety and depression, sleep disturbance, cognitive decline. But early symptoms interpreted this as alcoholism, nervous disposition, moral weakness, and later alcohol became a mental illness. The industrial component disappeared completely from the record. So, historically, sugar was ignored entirely. Alcohol was blamed individually, and sulfur and toxins were minimized or siloed. And the result, chronic toxic metabolic injury, was fragmented into lifestyle and psychiatric categories. This is a system failure. Alcohol was recognized early, but in the wrong way. It was used to dismiss, not to understand. Its interaction with industrial toxins was never seriously studied. It helped obscure sulfur related and chemical disease. Alcohol also reinforced psychiatric and behavioral explanations for physical injury. So, why sulfur preservatives matter biologically? Sulfur, I talked about all those processed foods because sulfites consume the glutatone. They stress the liver detox pathways. They trigger bronchospasm, headaches, neurological symptoms in sensitive people. They interact badly with alcohol. They are worsened by high sugar intake. What about a perfect storm, right? And the symptoms they commonly reported are chest tightness, heart rhythm disturbance, brain fog, anxiety like symptoms, and fatigue. These effects were historically under-recognized and often dismissed as asthma, anxiety, food sensitivity, and behavioral issues. Who is most affected? Well, people in the high risk groups, people with asthma, liver disease, chronic exposure to industrial sulfur, heavy alcohol users, diets high in sugar or ultra processed food, communities with limited access to fresh food. And that includes just about everybody, right? So sulfur preservatives are common, legal, and cheap. Sulfur preservatives cluster in processed and institutional food. Labeling rules allow undisclosed low level exposure. Sugar and alcohol worsen the sulfur burden. Chronic low dose exposure can look like anxiety, heart trouble, or neurological decline. Historically, these effects are rarely, and I mean rarely, linked back to sulfur. And another huge impact, I kept thinking, I'm missing something. It's our bodies. The human body is 60 to 70% water, and that matters chemically. Water is not passive in biology, it is a solvent, a reaction medium, a transport system. Any system that reacts with water or uses water to transform can act disproportionately. Well, anyway, it can act disproportionately strongly in the body. Sulfur compounds do exactly that. So sulfur becomes more dangerous because of water. And they knew this early on. I'll get to that in a bit here. This has been all done with intent. They did early human tests with sulfur. This was all done on purpose because I was wondering, why is sulfur different than uranium on our bodies? Well, sulfur, it's the sulfur in the water that makes it more dangerous than the actual uranium does. So the danger begins when sulfur interacts with water, oxygen, or heat. This interaction happens easily in lungs, eyes, skin, and mucous membranes. So when sulfur compounds meet moisture, you get the sulfuric acid, you get the sulfic acid, you get the hydrogen sulfide. Your body provides warmth, oxygen, and moisture. In other words, ideal reaction conditions. Heat makes sulfur compounds more aggressive. Heat increases vaporization, reaction speed, tissue penetration, and this is critical. When sulfur compounds are heated by engines, generators, refineries, or furnaces, aerosolized or inhaled, they enter the body already in a highly reactive state. Once inside moist lung tissue, they rapidly convert into acids and enzyme inhibitors. Your lungs are especially vulnerable because lungs are warm, wet, thin walled, oxygen rich. Sulfur gases dissolve instantly in lung moisture and begin reacting before the body can neutralize them. Effects include chemical burns at the micro level, inflammation, bronchoconstriction, long-term scarring. This is why sulfur exposure is associated with asthma, chronic bronchitis, cardiovascular stress. And sulfur also targets the proteins and enzymes, not just the tissue. Sulfur compounds bind strongly to sulfur containing amino acids, iron containing enzymes, mitochondrial proteins. Hydrogen sulfide, in particular, blocks a systematic oxidase, disrupts cellular energy production, mimics oxygen deprivation. This is systematic, not just local irritation. Sulfur is not dangerous because it is radioactive, exotic, or rare. It is dangerous because it is chemically reactive in water, biologically ubiquitous, continuously produced by industrial combustion. Radiation damages DNA problematically. Sulfur damages proteins, membranes, blood chemistry in your respiration immediately and repeatedly, dose after dose. So, why is this so misunderstood or underestimated? Well, you always want to hide the tools of your destruction now, don't you? Sulfur compounds dissipate quickly outdoors, leave little residue, cause symptoms that resemble infection, stress, or mental health issues. This makes attribution difficult. The harm is diffused, chronic, and accumulative, not dramatic, but biologically real. So, because the human body is mostly water, sulfur compounds become more dangerous, not less. Water activates sulfur chemistry. Water accelerates tissue damage. Water distributes the injuries throughout the body. And heat amplifies this effect. Sulfur is not a weapon by intent, but in warm, wet, oxygenated biology, it behaves like one by chemistry. And water is the key difference. The human body is 60 to 70% water. That fact strongly favors chemical hazards over radiological hazards in day to day biological damage. Because, yes, sulfur damages in water and the uranium does not. So, water is a reaction medium. Water enables acid formation. Water transports dissolved substances directly into cells, blood, and organs. Sulfur compounds actively use water. Uranium largely does not. So sulfur becomes very dangerous because of body water. Most harmful sulfur exposures are gases or aerosols formed by heat and combustion. Sulfur dioxide, sulfur trioxide, and hydrogen sulfide. When these enter the body, water immediately converts them into biologically aggressive agents. So, yeah, your lungs, eyes, and blood produce warmth, moisture, and oxygen. This combination activates sulfur chemistry instantly. Damage begins within seconds to minutes. But uranium does not become more dangerous because of water. And this is why I'm going to die on this hill. It is sulfur, not uranium, that's really getting us. But don't ignore the uranium. I'll get to that later. But sulfur turns out, in my mind at least, to be far more dangerous at this stage. So uranium does not become more dangerous because of water, because uranium exposure has two distinct hazards. It has a radiological hazard, alpha radiation. Internalized uranium is dangerous, but radiation does not depend on water chemistry. Damage is probabilistic and delayed DNA damage over time. Uranium behaves chemically like other heavy metals. It stresses kidneys and bones. This toxicity is not amplified by water in the same way sulfur is. Water does not activate uranium in a more aggressive chemical form inside the body. And the time scale is the decisive factor. Sulfur exposure acts immediately, causes inflammation, acid injury, enzyme inhibition. Repeated low doses accumulate damage quickly. Symptoms appear fast and are often misattributed, whereas uranium exposure acts slowly. Health effects may take years or decades, requires ingestion or inhalation of specific particles. Damage is often statistical, with increased cancer risk. But from a biological standpoint, sulfur is a fast chemical attacker. Uranium is a slow probabilistic threat. So, sulfur compounds disrupt proteins and enzymes directly. It interferes with mitochondrial energy production. It causes chemical burns at a cellular scale. Hydrogen sulfide is especially potent because it blocks the histamine oxidase. It prevents cells from using oxygen. It causes internal suffocation even when oxygen is present. This effect is water dependent, not immediate. Uranium does none of this directly. Why sulfur often causes more real world illness. In practical exposure scenarios in industry, in power generation, in refining backup and generators, sulfur compounds are ubiquitous. Exposure is repeated. Doses are sublethal but chronic. Damage accumulates silently. But uranium exposure, by contrast, is rare, is more tightly regulated, requires specific pathways to cause harm. So the water in our bodies makes sulfur compounds more biologically dangerous than uranium in most real-world exposure scenarios. Not because sulfur is stronger in theory, but because water activates sulfur chemistry. Heat accelerates it. Biology provides ideal conditions. Damage is immediate and cumulative. Uranium, on the other hand, is dangerous primarily over long time horizons. Sulfur is dangerous right now, every breath, every cell, because we are made of water. So, I went looking for how many Native Americans were killed, or I would say murdered, over all this. There is no precise death count for Native Americans harmed or killed due to sulfur exposure associated with uranium mining and processing. The historical record does not support a single number, largely because exposure pathways were fragmented, misclassified, and poorly documented. However, based on available occupational studies, environmental studies, and excess mortality analysis, it is reasonable to conclude that tens of thousands of Native Americans experienced serious illness and that many thousands likely died prematurely due to combined uranium and sulfur related exposures, especially between the 1940s and 1980s. The absence of a definitive number is not accidental, it is structural. So, why does a clean death count not even exist? Well, several factors. There was no baseline health data prior to the mining, no systematic death certification linking exposure to cause. Symptoms were misattributed to tuberculosis, pneumonia, alcoholism, or natural causes. Sulfur exposure was just not tracked, despite its central role in uranium mining, thanks to those attorneys. Jurisdiction gaps between federal agencies and tribal lands. And when I said to those attorneys, the attorneys fighting for the Native Americans were not the problem here. It was the attorneys fighting to protect the government that were. I don't have a lot of faith in a lot of attorneys, but I don't want to throw them all into one bucket. There are some Native Indians who have studied law in return to study help their own people. I am hoping one of you might know one of these people, and one of you might happen to send this information to these people. Do you realize the correct information would throw this all on its head? Every bit of this criminal activity against these poor people would be removed with the truth. But I will hop down off my box right now and I will keep reading. Now is not the time for me to start exploding. The uranium sulfur exposure change. Uranium mining on native land involved two overlapping hazards. Uranium related hazards with radioactive dust and the radon gas and the heavy metal toxicity. These were later acknowledged, at least partially. And then there were these sulfur related hazards, which were largely ignored. The sulfuric acid used in mining was ignored. Sulfur dioxide and sulfur aerosols were ignored. Acid mist created by heat, moisture, and ventilation failures were ignored. Sulfur exposure was continuous, inhaled, chemically activated by lung moisture, rarely measured, never treated as a primary hazard. Across multiple reservations with uranium operations, the following patterns were repeatedly documented: chronic lung disease, severe asthma and bronchitis, cardiovascular failure, kidney damage, neurological impairment, shortened life expectancy. These outcomes are chemically consistent with sulfur exposure and biologically consistent with combined sulfur uranium stress. While exact counts are unavailable, reasonable lower bound estimates can be structured. Because hundreds of uranium mines operated on or near native land, tens of thousands of native workers and residents were exposed. Excess mortality among miners and nearby communities is well documented. Lung and kidney disease rates far exceeded national averages. So, several thousand deaths can be reasonably linked to uranium exposure alone. Additional thousands of deaths are likely attributable to sulfur related respiratory and cardiovascular damage. Many deaths were never classified as occupational or environmental. So, I think it was just all a big trick with this uranium part. Radiation was framed as a sole hazard. Sulfur chemistry was excluded from analysis. Responsibility was diffused across agencies. Liability was delayed until most victims were already dead. By focusing exclusively on radiation, chemical injury pathways were totally ignored. Acute symptoms were misdiagnosed. Accountability was minimized. This framing systematically undercounted harm to these people. So, a large number of Native Americans died earlier than they otherwise would have due to a combination of uranium and sulfur exposures, and the full scale of this harm was never counted. So, did they have prior knowledge? Well, you bet your booties they had prior knowledge. They were testing on prior knowledge. This was a failure of accountability and justice. Prior knowledge of sulfur toxicity from early mustard gas human testing. By the end of World War I, and unquestionably by the 1920s and 1940s, military and medical authorities knew in detail that sulfur based compounds caused severe, systematic, water activated injury to human tissue. That knowledge predates large scale uranium mining on native lands by decades. And I can say this clearly: The core toxic principles of sulfur chemistry were already well understood long before mid 20th century industrial and military programs expanded. They had prior knowledge. This is about eugenics. This was done with intent. Sulfur mustard or mustard gas is not a nerve agent. It is a sulfur-based vesicant. Its defining properties react aggressively with water, achelate DNA and proteins, cause delayed but severe tissue injury, penetrates skin and lungs easily, produces injury without immediate pain masking the exposure. And this was all studied during World War I. Human exposure was studied early and deliberately from 1917 to 1918. Sulfur mustard was deployed on a mass scale. Medical corps documented blistering of moist tissue, catastrophic lung injury, delayed respiratory failure, eye damage and blindness, immune suppression. These were not theoretical observations, they were clinical records. After World War I, controlled testing did not stop. Documented programs include at Edgewood Arsenal. Keep your eye on Edgewood Arsenal. I'll be back with that in a very dramatic way down the road. Edgewood Arsenal in the United States. Human exposure tests involve sulfur mustard from 1910 onward. In the UK, they were also doing long-running chemical exposures. And in Bari Harbor, wherever that is, in 1943, accidental release of sulfur mustard with detailed medical follow-up happened. By World War II, the medical literature already described sulfur mustard as water activated, systematic toxic, particularly destructive to lungs and bone marrow, capable of causing long-term disease, not just acute injury. So, what was known scientifically by the 1940s, by the time uranium mining expanded on native lands, authorities already knew that sulfur compounds became more toxic in warm, wet tissue. They already knew that caused delayed respiratory collapse. They already knew that damaged DNA and immune systems. They already knew it produced chronic illnesses long after exposure. And they already knew they are difficult to trace once exposure ends. That is the whole key here, right? These findings were all published, classified, taught, and incorporated into military doctrine. So, everybody knew, but the people who could have known, right? The people in charge who were conducting this, they all knew. So, okay, let me see here. I need to take a break here, but let me finish up here a little bit. So, sulfur-based chemical toxicity was well documented early. Yeah, I'd say the early 1900s is pretty early. Authorities understood water-activated lung injury. Long-term health damage was well known. This knowledge existed before large-scale uranium programs. So, sulfur was not an unknown danger. Its capacity to exploit the water-based nature of the human body was already proven, documented, and medically understood decades before mid-century industrial and mining operations expanded. What followed was not ignorance of sulfur chemistry, but selective attention to which hazards were counted, named, and compensated. And where'd we get a lot of these ideas from? Well, they did a lot of movies about these disasters. Yeah, I'm not going to have any real conclusions about some of these things. I don't know why this is here, but I'll say it right now. If you suspect anything in your house, anything, I mean anything at all, If you see that you have a transformer hooked up to your smart meter, or if you see a lot of transformers in the area, do not close off the doors. The door to my back bedroom where I used to sleep is a very dangerous room. I had an accumulation of sulfur there recently, a few days ago, and I had a crash down that lasted for a couple of days. What happened was that it's below zero for a few days here because we're in winter here in Nebraska. So I had the thermostat. I run my thermostat between 44 and 46 degrees. I know it's pretty cold, but I've got a little bit of neurological things going on, so I'm not that sharp in the ticky ticky. So what happened was I usually keep my front door open and my fan's all on, right? Well, my front door had gotten closed and it created something in my hallway. I have a little tiny hallway. I don't have a big house. I walked into that hallway to get something out of that hall cupboard, immediately started moving into throwing up. And yeah, there was a toxic load in there because the air had not circulated. So if you suspect anything, do not close off that room. Do not. It will make things far worse. So yeah, a lot of what we've been learning, I'm going to take a break. Excuse me. Hold on a second. Yeah, speaking of taking a break, I'm going to take a break here, and I have confidence that when I return, I will be able to finish off this show because I have much more I want to talk to you about next. And so anyway, so let's just put this on hold for now. Okay, there were several movies. I'm not going to go over all of them. I'm not sure these movies were really nuclear disasters or were they sulfur disasters. The first one, China Syndrome, excuse me, 1979. It was a near meltdown of a U.S. nuclear power plant caused by corporate negligence and cost cutting, focused on a coolant failure, cover ups, and media suppression. So, what's interesting is this about the China Syndrome is 3 Mile Island nuclear accident in Pennsylvania occurred 12 days after the film's release. Partial core meltdown, radiation release, mass excavations, and long-term public loss of public trust. So, the failure mode depicted in the film closely resembled the real accident. Well, real according to whom, right? Obviously, it was predictive programming to put out the movie right around the same time, right? And nuclear industry executives openly admitted the timing was catastrophic for public confidence. And then the movie Silkwood, 1983, based on the real story of Karen Silkwood, a plutonium fuel plant worker exposing safety violations, focused on contamination, worker exposure, and corporate retaliation. Released amid heightened awareness of radiation exposure risk and whistleblower suppression, came during ongoing revelations about worker contamination across U.S. nuclear facilities. And that increased scrutiny of nuclear fuel fabrication plants, strengthened whistleblower protections. Well, yeah, good luck on that one. Okay, so then there was a movie called Threads in 1984 out of the UK, a realistic portrayal of nuclear war and societal collapse in the UK. Released during the peak Cold War, broadcast reportedly caused mass distress, influenced nuclear policy debates in the UK and Europe. Yeah, another movie the day after 1983, a nuclear war between the US and USSR from the perspective of civilians. And that was screened for President Ronald Reagan and Pentagon officials. Reagan later wrote that it deeply affected his thinking on nuclear weapons. It heightened alert postures and multiple near miss incidents in the early 1980s. And then there was Chernobyl, the HBO miniseries in 2019. Yeah, dramatization of the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. So, several nuclear disaster films appeared just before or during real nuclear crisis, and most famously, the China Syndrome happened around the 3 Mile Island time. So, yeah, So, and there's people that say, well, all those power stations are really fake anyways. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to say they're fake because some things are real, right? Two things can be true at the same time. I think those power stations that we think are nuclear are likely sulfur. But so what is real? Well, microwave ovens are real. They really heat food. And you need to be careful when you check for information because according to ChatGPT, microwaves don't use radiation. They came up with this other explanation, maybe because these data centers are trying to push for nuclear now, so they're softening the blow on what microwave ovens really do, but that's not true. So we are in fact getting radiation. So if these ignorant people that claim it's all fake, that is a way to mislead the public, okay? Just like these movies misled people into thinking it was all nuclear, right? Microwaves heat food. Microwave ovens use radiation to heat food. I checked two or three different search engines and I finally got the answer, right? So, microwave ovens use radiation to heat food. However, the real health concerns with microwaves have more to do with the food and containers we put them in. So, microwaves cause polar molecules, mainly water, also fats and sugars, to rotate back and forth. This motion creates frictional heating. Heat then spreads by conduction inside the food. But they claim that this ionization is non-ionizing. And what you want to look for is it likely is ionizing, right? They tend to slap that thing on. They say, "Oh, nope, nope, no, Rob, this is non-ionizing, nothing to worry about here." When in fact, you'll find that it probably is ionizing. That's where you need to learn to be your own detective. So they claim that microwave ovens use non ionizing radiation, also known as microwaves, to heat food. This type of radiation does not make food radioactive. Microwaves are produced by a device called a magnetron and are beamed into the metal interior of the microwave oven. Anything inside the oven absorbs these rays, which excite the water molecules within the food, causing it to heat up rapidly. So yes, but then I looked for what are some dangers of microwave ovens. Well, yeah, radiation leaks. Microwave ovens are dangerous to keep in radiation, but some, yeah, burns. Most injuries from microwave ovens are the result of heat-related burns. So supposedly microwaves, the radiation is non-ionizing. They claim that Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and cell phone signals are also non-ionizing. I beg to differ. So, but sulfur exposure can cause lung destruction, chronic bronchitis, fibrosis, neurological symptoms, cardiovascular stress, DNA damage due to oxidative mechanisms, cancer promotion, especially in the lung. These overlap heavily with radiation sickness, radon exposure, psychosomatic illness, and anxiety disorders. So, without precise exposure monitoring, sulfur injury can easily be misattributed. So, sulfur was legally and medically downgraded. Sulfur compounds were labeled, historically, they were labeled irritants, odor nuisances, or industrial byproducts. And radiation was framed as exotic, dangerous, scientifically prestigious, and federally regulated. So sulfur was normalized and radiation harm was litigated. So many injuries were attributed to radon, smoking, poverty, stress, and lifestyle. So the key inversion that created the confusion, uranium was treated as the cause. Sulfur was treated as the tool. In reality, for many workers and communities, sulfur exposure was continuous, inhaled, high dose, poorly monitored. Radiation exposure, on the other hand, was intermittent, often external, sometimes lower than assumed. But lawsuits, regulations, and compensation frameworks were built around uranium, not sulfur. So sulfur injuries were often invisible in records, misclassified, psychologicized, time barred. So I feel like uranium really looks like sulfur because uranium mining uses sulfur chemistry. Uranium mining creates sulfur acid. Uranium also creates sulfur solutions. Uranium tailings create sulfuric residues. Uranium cleanup produces sulfuric neutralization. So, for affected people, sulfur was the exposure vector. Uranium was the legal and symbolic framework. So, instead of uranium is really sulfur, in uranium mining and processing, sulfur chemistry was the dominant exposure pathway for many workers and communities, but harm was legally and medically attributed to radiation instead, obscuring sulfur's role. So you got to ask yourself, why? Why all the work to go to obscure the existence of sulfur? Because they already knew since the 1915 or 16 that sulfur was dangerous. So they had every reason to want to exclude sulfur, right? So uranium is not sulfur per se, but it looks the same. Sulfur is the workhorse, the exposure medium, but often the unacknowledged injury source in the uranium story. So, nuclear signatures were measured poorly, precisely. Chemical exposures like sulfur, acid mist, and metals were poorly measured. The most precise data dominated the narrative. The messier exposure were sidelined. And I would say it's all on purpose because they knew what the impact was be, right? Uranium is not defined into existence by charts. Uranium can be detected by Geiger counters, alpha spectrometry, gamma spectrometry, mass spectrometry, neutron activation, university labs worldwide, non US governments, and adversarial states. For a lie that bold, if the whole thing about nuclear was a big fat lie, then that would mean that every physics lab on Earth, including rivals, would have to be colluding on the big lie. So what did they do instead? Well, each party just argued that exposure happened elsewhere. Exposure was below the limits. And that's the other thing. They set the limits, right? Another agent was responsible. They also claim evidence is insufficient. Statute of limitations have expired. So that forces the worker to prove that the worker in the mine, okay, the guy shoveling the stuff in the mine, he has to prove what specific agent got him. He has to prove what specific dose got him. They have to prove what specific time they got. They have to do exclusive causation, and that is impossible for a worker in a mine to go and try to prove, right? So, sulfur poisoning hits many organs at once, fluctuates with heat and airflow, produces panic, derealization, and agitation, affects breathing and cognitive simultaneously, leaves visible dental and skin damage. And boy, do I have the dental teeth to show you. Just check out my teeth over on my website. Don't go there if you're feeling queasy. So, and that all gets so it can absolutely look like sulfur, but is the root of everything if you lived in or near refineries, power plants, mills, mining zones, wastewater plants, and data center backup generators. So, or if your symptoms are episodic, they fluctuate with heat, air movement, or indoors versus outdoors. They affect breathing, skin, teeth, nerves, cognitive, panic, and fatigue. Sulfur is one of several powerful, historically under-acknowledged toxic contributors that can mimic many major diseases. Sulfur dioxide, they're running those generators at those data centers, right? Bad, bad, bad idea. Sulfur dioxide at the generation levels can constrict airways in minutes, trigger asthma attacks, cause chest pain and coughing, create panic like air hunger, damage teeth over time, injure the nervous system with repeated exposure. And because what happens is these releases are intermittent, weather dependent, and often at night, people struggle to document it. A large data center running diesel backup generators can dump hundreds of pounds of sulfur pollution into the air in a single hour, right at ground level, often near homes, even when there is no emergency. This makes them one of the most intense short burst sulfur sources in modern cities, even if they don't run all the time. If you ever wanted to stay, sulfur exposure can mimic radiation injury. It can trigger panic like syndromes. It can cause neurological damage. It can accelerate dental and skin destruction. It can worsen cardiovascular risk. It can compound cancer risk in already stressed tissue. It can be misclassified as psychiatric illness. After sulfur exposure has been minimized, misnamed, and misclassified, people have written about sulfur as a serious health toxin in Navajo and other communities, but almost nobody ties it together in the sulfur versus radon misdiagnosed mental illness. The pieces are scattered across uranium, coal, and refinery literature. So, why don't people easily connect these dots to sulfur? Well, because the symptoms look like everything else. Sulfur exposure mimics anxiety and panic attacks, asthma, allergies, long COVID, mold illness, radon fear, stress. So, doctors, of course, with those two snakes on their logos, usually label it as psychosomatic, anxiety related, environmental sensitivity, idiopathic, meaning we don't know. Once that label is applied, the investigation usually stops. So the monitoring is weak or manipulated. Most neighborhoods that they're running these backup generators on do not have sulfur dioxide monitors. They only have regional air stations miles away. These stations often average readings over hours, which hides short toxic spikes. Generator testing may last 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. That's long enough to make people sick, but too short to follow up cleanly in averages. So data centers sit in zoning blind spots. They're often built in industrial residential buffer zones on reclaimed farmland, low income or rural communities, tribal or unincorporated land. This means fewer inspections, weaker enforcement, less political protection for residents. Have communities complain? Yes, residents near large data centers have reported sudden sulfur chemical smells, diesel haze events, nosebleeds, respiratory spikes, neurological symptoms, but complaints get categorized as odor nuisance, noise complaints, air quality event with no violation detected. That rewording declassifies it as poisoning and turns it into a lifestyle issue instead of a regulatory issue. So, why it's harder than pinning down radiation or radon? Because radiation has badges, meters, and federal tracking, has cancer registries tied to exposure zones. But sulfur disperses quickly, doesn't leave a long term fingerprint, converts chemically in the air, produces delayed illness, not instant collapse. So years later, the exposure is gone, the illness remains, and causation becomes impossible to prove in court. But data center neighbors specifically are mostly talking about noise, water use, property values, visual blight, not chemistry. So, yes, it's very hard to pin down, Most residents are not being told it's sulfur. And when people get sick, the explanation usually becomes psychological or idiopathic instead of chemical. So people have written about some of these things around plants, but there are also classic sulfur air pollution disasters that everyone acknowledges. There was a big one in Pennsylvania in 1948 where a trapped mixture of sulfur and other industrial emissions killed 20 people and sickened thousands. So sulfur is poison to the respiratory, cardiovascular, and becomes mental health damage, and that is all well documented. Environmental justice framings for poor and minority communities taking the hit, also well documented. But what doesn't exist in mainstream literature, no one has stated explicitly argues that sulfur was downgraded to an odor nuisance to avoid criminal liability. I'm the one saying that, but I couldn't find anybody else saying that. And no one has also stated or builds a full narrative that sulfur poisoning gets systematically relabeled as radon plus anxiety and psychiatric. People have gotten close. People have gotten close, but they're not making that specific sulfur radon swap argument. And that's what I'm trying to say here right now. Basically, not written in the mainstream, there is no cohesive argument that sulfur was strategically framed as an odor rather than a poison to avoid criminal liability. It was not written in the mainstream, a historical narrative that sulfur damage got folded into radon in radiation stories, especially for uranium regions, while the sulfur piece just disappeared. What all this means is that I am sharing with you my work, which none of the people that are qualified to really do my work, the historians, the scientists, none of them have talked about any of this. Is it because they're all in on it? Well, not necessarily. That would be a pretty absurd thing to say. But for their own purposes, people like to stay quiet, right? People like to stay quiet to preserve their life. They shut up when they think that they may be treading on something dangerous. They don't want to become another person like myself. They don't want to become targeted. Truth be known, I could have moved, but I chose not to. Where would I go? What would I do? If I moved, one of the requirements of me moving would be that I would have to shut up. I refuse to shut up. So that's why I didn't move. Not because I couldn't move or I'm too stupid to figure it out. I didn't move because moving would mean I had to shut up. I'm not going to shut up. I will keep this mouth going as long as this microphone is hooked up and I can talk. So, from 1900 to 1930s, sulfur is openly acknowledged as a mining poison. Before the nuclear era, sulfur dangers were well documented in hard rock mining. Bad air in mines equals sulfur gases plus carbon monoxide. Acid mist equals sulfuric acid aerosol from the wet rocks. Lung burns, chronic coughing, eye damage, nerve effects are recognized sulfur injuries. Ventilation standards were written specifically because of sulfur gases. But of course, that didn't apply to the native Indians. They didn't get any of these things to mitigate what was going on there. So at this stage, sulfur equals a primary airborne danger. There is no legal suppression. It's not just standard industry hygiene. So 1930s to 1942, uranium became a strategic material and the secrecy begins. And as atomic research accelerates, uranium mining quietly shifts from civilian geology to military controlled supply. Medical reporting starts tightening. Chemical hazards begin to be handled under vague terms like dust exposure, irritant gases, poor air quality. Well, yeah, by 1930 to 1942, they'd known for 20 or 30 years what the deal was. So 1942 to 1947, the Manhattan Project period, sulfur officially disappears from the narrative. Once the nuclear program is formalized, all uranium mining becomes part of a classified weapons supply chain. The Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, takes control after the war. Medical studies are redesigned to track radiation, radon, and gamma exposure. Chemical hazards are removed as independent variables. This is the formal moment when sulfur disappears from causation models. From this point forward, if it isn't radioactive, it does not exist legally. 1947 to 1960, medical records were rewritten to match radiation theory. During peak Navajo mining, autopsies and hospital records increasingly list unknown lung disease, fibrosis of uncertain origin, chronic respiratory condition. Earlier terms like chemical pneumonia, acid lung, and gas injury get phased out. Sulfur doesn't vanish physically, it vanishes terminologically. Once the word disappears, the lawsuits can be built. 1960s to 1977, federal worker safety laws appears, but nuclear work is exempted. Funny thing, huh? The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, is created in 1971. But most uranium exposure occurred before OSHA existed. Nuclear supply work is federally shielded. OSHA has no retroactive authority. It also focuses on industrial employers, not federal atomic programs. This is the legal black hole where sulfur should have re entered and it didn't. 1978 to 1989, the Navajo lawsuits begin. Sulfur is already invisible. By the time large legal actions start, the only recognized exposure framework is radon for lung cancer and compensation. Courts demanded a single cause, a radioactive fingerprint. Mixed chemical radiological injury is rejected as too speculative, not federally compensatable, not supported by regulatory precedent. Sulfur is now legally unusable even if it's physically present. 1990s, radiation only compensation is permanently locked in. Congress passes the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, and they only compensate uranium workers with radon linked lung cancer or atomic test downwinders with radiation exposure or nuclear weapon workers with radiation dose records. They explicitly do not include sulfur poisoning, chemical gas injury, acid lung damage, heat accelerated toxin absorption, mixed exposure syndromes. This law permanently seals sulfur outside the compensation system. In the 1990s to 2000s, medical textbooks quietly standardized radon only explanations. So from this point forward, public health literature simplifies uranium mine illnesses to primarily radon induced, or training for doctors excludes chemical mine gas injury. So a new generation of physicians literally never see sulfur listed as casual. Once medicine forgets, courts cannot remember. The 2000s to present, sulfur no longer exists in the uranium legal narrative. In modern discussions of the Navajo Nation uranium legacy, in the medium, they go to radiation exposure. The courts go to radon causation. Compensation goes to radiation dose. Histories become atomic harms. So sulfur is now treated as a footnote, a background irritant, or a non issue, even though chemically it never stopped being present. Sulfur disappeared as a legal cause between 1945 and 1950 when radiation was formalized as a sole recognized injury mechanism by federal atomic agencies. Everything after that enforces that decision. So the bottom line, sulfur evidence didn't vanish because it was disproven. It vanished because the law froze causation around radiation. Compensation systems only pay for radiation. Medical training only tracks radiation patterns. Mixed chemical injury breaks clean liability models. And sulfur injuries would have proven ventilation failure, chemical negligence, federal cover-ups, criminal industry exposure. So the record was never corrected. They were simplified until sulfur no longer fit anywhere. So warm air holds gases longer. Hot air expands, traps fumes in low ventilation spaces. Sulfur gases become more reactive in heat. Sulfuric acid aerosols stay airborne longer in dry, hot environments. Heat increases lung absorption rate, and those Navajo mines were hot, poorly ventilated, chemically active, full of sulfur bearing rock and acid processing. So workers were breathing a radically different chemical atmosphere than what the lawsuits modeled. Why sulfur plus heat was legally inconvenient. If courts had fully acknowledged sulfur plus heat effects, it would have meant illness was not just radiation. Injuries were not unavoidable. Ventilation failure becomes criminal. Chemical poisoning becomes provable. Medical damage no longer fits heat radiation over timelines. That would have exploded government liability beyond radiation regulations. The Navajo lawsuits did not seriously examine sulfur behavior in hot air. They did not examine heat driven sulfur toxicity was legally sidelined. Workers were exposed to a mixed chemical, radiological atmosphere. The legal system reduced that complexity to radon did it. The government chose a single cause narrative, radiation only. From the very start, federal policy driven by the Atomic Energy Commission defined uranium injury as a radiation problem, not a chemical one. That locked the entire legal system into this narrow equation. Sickness equals radiation exposure and mainly radon. Once that definition was baked into federal safety rules, medical surveillance, and worker compensation law, then anything that wasn't radiation legally did not count. Sulfur is a chemical toxin, not a radioactive one, so it was pushed outside the legal framework from day one. And I would say with 100% full knowledge of what they were doing. This is 100% criminal, full stop. The law that paid victims only recognized radiation. When Congress finally responded, it passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or the RECA, in 1990. And RECA only compensates lung cancer, certain radiation linked cancers, and strictly defined radiation exposure pathways. It does not cover sulfur poisoning, sulfuric acid lung burns, heat enhanced chemical gas injury, diesel plus sulfur inhalation, mixed chemical plus radiology injury. So even if sulfur caused the damage, there was no legal category to fill it in under. No category, no payment, no court pathway. Heat was treated as working conditions, not a toxic amplifier. The mines on Navajo land were extremely hot, poorly ventilated, chemically active. But legally, heat was treated as mere discomfort, not a multiplier of toxicity. Courts did not allow arguments like heat increases sulfur gas volatility, hot lungs absorb sulfur deeper, warm air traps sulfur aerosols longer, heat accelerates chemical injury. They couldn't hear any of that because once heat is recognized as a toxic amplifier, then ventilation failure becomes negligence. Not just exposure, but enhanced exposure becomes provable and liability explodes. So the system intentionally treated heat as irrelevant to causation. Medical experts were trained to look for radiation fingerprints only. Doctors evaluating Navajo miners were taught to look for radon induced lung cancer patterns, radiation fibrosis signatures. They were not trained or funded to investigate sulfuric acid scarring, hydrogen sulfide nerve injury, mixed chemical radiation lung burns, or heat enhanced imbalance injury. So sulfur damage was medically misclassified as non-specific lung disease, which killed the lawsuits. Mixed exposure science was legally unwelcome. The most dangerous truth is this: radiation plus sulfur plus heat creates injuries faster and differently than radiation alone. But the legal system demanded one cause, one exposure, one straight timeline. Mixed chemical breaks that model, so courts quietly enforced a rule of if we can't isolate it to radiation, we don't litigate it. That automatically erased sulfur and especially heat driven sulfur behavior. Why this matters, especially to the Navajo Nation? Well, Navajo miners worked in desert heat, in poorly ventilated shafts, in sulfur rich rock, in acid leach environments, which means that sulfur stayed airborne longer. Lungs absorbed it more efficiently. Acid mist penetrated deeper. Nerve damage increased. Lung scarring accelerated. But legally, the courts only heard they had radon exposure. Everything else was filtered out. The quiet legal trick that made sulfur invisible. If sulfur became if sulfur caused the injury, it becomes a workplace chemical hazard. Workplace chemical hazards fall under OSHA, but many mines predated OSHA, and federal nuclear work was shielded by national security. So sulfur claims were bounced between agencies until no court claimed jurisdiction. Radiation claims, by contrast, had a special federal compensation lane called that RECA. So sulfur wasn't just ignored, it was procedurally orphaned out of the whole system. So heat driven sulfur toxicity was sidelined because the government defined uranium injury as radiation only. Compensation law only pays radiation victims. Heat was legally downgraded to working conditions. Mixed exposure shattered simple legal causation models. Sulfur injuries had no clean jurisdictional home. Recognizing heat plus sulfur would have triggered massive negligence liability. And I hope it triggers it too today. Any lawyers out there? Any lawyers out there wanting to do the right thing? You got your ticket here. I've laid out your first part of your entire case for you. So, okay, let me see here. I've already talked about a lot of them. I'm going to skim down here. Long-term exposure outcomes, months to years. This is where cancer becomes realistic. The lung disease. Chronic sulfur gas exposure causes COPD, pulmonary fibrosis, permanent airway scarring, reduced oxygen exchange for life. This is identical to damage patterns seen in refinery workers and smelter workers. And the cancer risk, long term sulfur and acid aerosol exposure is associated with lung cancer, throat cancer, possible esophagus cancer. Here's the mechanism: sulfur gases form sulfuric acid on wet lung tissue. God, I've already gone all over all of this. But anyway, so sulfur exposure also increases heart attacks, arrhythmias, stroke risk, and systematic inflammation because sulfur gases cross directly into the bloodstream through the lung tissue. And the neurological injury, which is often mistaken for mental illness. Chronic low dose exposure can cause personality changes, depression, cognitive slowing, sleep disorders, memory loss. This is why long term gas victims often get dismissed as psychiatric cases. If sulfur were entering homes, symptoms would look nonspecific. If it's in your home, cancer might show up 10 to 30 years later. If it's in your home, doctors will label it idiopathic COPD or environmental asthma or anxiety disorder or unknown origin lung cancer. And unless air sampling is done during exposure, the source disappears. That's a pretty good trick, right? So, yeah, so lung scarring, yeah, okay, I'm going to scroll down here a bit. I've already talked about oxidative stress and all of that, but yeah, it has to do with all that moisture and stuff. And okay, immune systems collapse almost look identical between sulfur and radiation. With radiation, it suppresses the bone marrow, drops the white blood cells, and causes infection vulnerability. In sulfur, it directly poisons the white blood cells, suppresses immune signaling, increases infection frequency, and that results in both people getting sick all the time and poor wound healing and chronic inflammation. And cancer development follows the same mutation pathway. Radiation causes cancer by breaking DNA, causing misrepair, triggering malignant growth years later. Sulfur causes cancer by chronic acid burns to tissue, endless repair cycles. DNA replication occurs from oxidative stress. Both pathways lead to lung cancer, throat cancer, blood carriers in some cases. The timeline is identical: 10 to 30 years of delayed appearance. Neurological effects mimic radiation brain. Radiation exposure causes brain fog, personality changes, memory loss, sleep disruption. Chronic sulfur exposure causes neuron inflammation, mitochondrial damage, neurotransmitter disruption. Observed outcome is the same: cognitive slowing, emotional flattening, depression, executive dysfunction, often misdiagnosed as PTSD, bipolar disorder, and anxiety disorder. Skin, teeth, and connective tissue damage match. Radiation does skin thinning, non-healing burns, hair loss, and tooth brittleness. Sulfur does chemical skin burns, collagen destruction, enamel erosion, and gum necrosis. Both of them cause accelerated aging appearance, chronic ulceration, and facial tissue damage. So, why does sulfur get mislabeled as radiation? But because both produce invisible exposure, both have delayed cancers, multi-system collapse, no obvious odor at low doses, no fingerprint once exposure stops. Once sulfur disperses, no isotope remains, no Geiger counter detects it, no permanent chemical marker stays in the blood. So doctors default to radiation, idiopathic, and unknown environmental exposure. So if a patient presents with progressive lung failure, neurological decline, immune suppression, delayed cancer, skin damage, and tooth destructions. Doctors might think radiation, autoimmune disease, genetic disorder, smoking, or stress. Sulfur is almost never considered unless an industrial accident is documented. Sulfur mimics radiation illness because both destroy the DNA through oxidative stress, both scar the lungs permanently, both suppress immunity, both cause delayed cancers, both damage the brain, both erase their own evidence over time. The only difference is the public narrative. Radiation is an acknowledged danger. Sulfur is an air quality issue. But biologically, the damage profile overlaps so closely that without environmental sampling, they are functionally indistinguishable. So yeah, and I've already talked a lot about this radon. I did a recap down below for you. I talked about this in the show that I did previous to this show, so you want to catch that one also. So yeah, they're all mimicking things exactly how this is all working, but the real culprit is the sulfur. That's really the genius in this whole hate crime they have going against the rest of us, right? So public messaging made radon the safe villain. Radon messaging framed it as a household hazard, testable, fixable with ventilation systems, a consumer safety issue. Sulfur would have framed power generation as a cause, mining as a cause, refining as a cause, military industry as a cause. So radon became the politically safe explanation. So the end result by the 1990s, lung cancer clusters became radon, basement air sickness became radon, mining lung deaths became radon, downwinder illness became radiation. Meanwhile, sulfur exposure was real, was medically destructive, was legally untouchable, and was quietly excluded from causational models. Sulfur exposure was blamed on radon because radon was invisible and already feared. Radon was natural and no one could be sued for it. Sulfur pointed directly at utilities, miners, and refineries. Both cause the same lung cancer and immune damage. Sulfur leaves no long term trace after the episode ends. Radon testing replaced sulfur testing in homes and mines. So the story became nature did this instead of industry did this. So why sulfur was downgraded to odor nuisance instead of classified and treated as a toxic poison, even though industrial medicine already knew it caused permanent energy injury. This wasn't a scientific mistake. It was a regulatory decision driven by liability control, energy politics, and legal strategy. Odor nuisance is a legal category, not a medical one. Calling sulfur an odor nuisance does three critical things. Legally, it shifts the harm onto the category of comfort, annoyance, property value loss, instead of poisoning and bodily injury in industrial negligence. It limits lawsuits to civil quality of life complaints instead of injury claims, wrongful death, and criminal liability. It caps the damages at relocation costs, ventilation fixes, instead of cancer settlements, lifetime medical care, or punitive damages. Once sulfur is legally framed as an odor, the medical damage becomes non actionable by default. Poison classifications would have crippled core U.S. industries. If sulfur gases had been classified as a residential poison, it would have directly implicated coal power plants, oil refineries, metal smelters, paper mills, sulfuric acid ore leaching, chemical weapons research corridors. That would have forced mandatory evacuation zones, criminal negligence standards, automatic medical surveillance, worker cancer presumptions and shut down authority. Instead, sulfur was framed as unpleasant, but not fundamentally dangerous. That kept energy, mining, and weapons productions legally protected. Smell was used to disguise invisible toxicity. This is one of the biggest tricks. At high doses, sulfur smells strong. At chronic low doses, sulfur can be odorless, or the nose becomes neurologically desensitized. So regulators leaned on this false logic. If you smell it, you're not in danger. But medically, the truth is the opposite. The most damaging exposure is continuous low dose inhalation. That is when cancer risk rises, lung scarring sets in, immune damage accumulates, neurological injury develops. By anchoring sulfur to smell instead of cellular injury, regulators converted a poison into a sensory irritation. So, radiation already occupied the invisible killer category. By the 1950s to 60s, radiation had already been designated as the invisible carcinogen, the delayed cancer cause, the immune suppressor. So the narrative became if it's invisible and deadly, it's radiation. If it smells bad, it's an odor nuisance. Sulfur was deliberately excluded from the invisible killer category, even though at low doses it is exactly that. Medical literature quietly acknowledged sulfur as toxic. Policy did not follow. Industrial medicine absolutely documented chemical pneumonia, lung fibrosis, acid aerosol burns, chronic bronchitis, cardiovascular stress, immune suppression, but regulatory agencies separated them into occupational poisoning. From residential exposure, they downgraded that just to a nuisance. So a refinery worker could be chemically injured, while a neighbor breathing the same gas was just annoyed. So odor nuisance absorbs the entire cancer clusters without triggering shutdowns. Once sulfur is an odor issue, epidemics get handled like this. Asthma surges become air quality. Lung cancer clusters become radon. Immune failure becomes stress. Brain fog becomes mental health. Tooth erosion becomes hygiene. And no industrial source is ever formally named as the cause. This is how entire regions can be chemically injured without any single event even being recognized after the poisoning. So, sulfur toxicity was framed as dangerous only at high doses, harmless at environmental levels. But toxicity now confirms chronic low dose inhalation is more carcinogen than short high dose exposure because it creates continuous inflammation, endless tissue repair, mutation accumulation. The dose based dismissal was a scientifically incomplete but legally convenient. So, reclassifying sulfur as a residential poison would retroactively reopen old cancer cases, trigger mining and refinery liability, expose historical regulatory fraud, undermine entire energy corridors. So instead of all that, the odor model stayed. The poisoning model stayed buried, and sulfur remained legally annoying, not injurious. So the bottom line, sulfur was labeled as an odor nuisance instead of a poison because odor avoids criminal liability. Odor prevents cancer presumptions. Odor protects power plants and refineries. Odor limits lawsuits to nuisance damages. Odor reframes poisoning complaints as exaggeration. Odor keeps sulfur invisible inside radon and air quality narratives. It was one of the most effective language based liability shields ever built into U.S. environmental law. and that was getting sulfur injury misclassified as anxiety or psychosomatic illness. This miscalculation happens through four well documented medical failure points. So, I've already talked about these chronic low dose things. I'm not going to go over them again, but yeah, sulfur injury happens at the cellular lining of the airways, the mitochondria inside neurons. So, yeah, these injuries do not show up in the basic screens doctors rely on for rapid triaging. So, the chart will read vital, stable, no objective findings. Once that sentence lands in a medical record, everything after it skews psychiatric. So, doctors are subconsciously trained to think if it were sulfur, the patient would smell it. If no one else in the house smells it, it can't be real. But this fails because low dose sulfur can be odorless. Smell receptors fatigue quickly. Some people genetically don't detect sulfur well. Indoor dispersion is uneven room to room. Boy, I got to tell you, that's the truth. So, when only one person in a household is symptomatic, that points to anxiety, even when it doesn't. So, the psychiatric diagnosis became legally safer. Once anxiety or somatic symptoms disorder is entered, the case stops being environmental. No industrial reporting is triggered. No air sampling is ordered. No regulatory agency is contacted. No source investigation occurs. From a systems from a systems perspective, psychiatric diagnosis quietly terminates liability pathways. And that has been well documented through all of this. Sulfur exposure can cause real neurological effects. Yeah, you really get confused and stuff. Okay, so let me see here. I'm trying to get this finished so I can close off this file. So yeah, it was all how they reclassified all this stuff. All they had to do was change the words around, right? And of course, they did this with full knowledge, which made it obviously a whole lot easier, right? So when sulfur injury gets misclassified as anxiety, symptoms are diffuse and mimic panic disorders. Routine hospital tests often look normal. Smell based logic fails at low doses. Psychiatric labels quietly shut down environmental investigations. Sulfur directly disrupts brain chemistry, which can look like mental illness. So, yeah, I would have to say this is all very intentionally done. And I've got all the words you want to have down below. And um, the reason you have to look at my website for the full show notes is because I don't know, it doesn't work on all these different audio platforms, and I don't have the brain power to try to fix it all. So I know on Spotify you don't get show notes, you do on Apple. They never really address the whole podcast deal. I'm not going to get into it right now. Um, yeah, so this is just my opinion. Hopefully, we're gathered around for you to form your own opinions. But yeah, I think that it's a pretty big trick, if you ask me. And I don't think it's going to be recoverable for a lot of people. That's the sad part. Um, because by the time the government acknowledged what happened, most of the damage was already done. The mines had closed, the workers were gone, the illnesses were scattered across decades. Yeah, so they only wanted to admit radiation, and they only did movies about radiation. So why is that? Are those nuclear power stations, are they loaded up with sulfur and maybe a touch of radiation, or are they simply sulfur, right? I don't know the answer. I'm hoping that maybe somebody will come along and pick up my work from here. Um, so I don't know. Is uranium in those nuclear power stations? Is that where the sulfur comes into our homes? The microwaves, the ear pods, they're all coming with uranium. So this idea that it's all fake is absolutely ignorant. It is ignorant to make such a statement. They are not all fake. Sulfur is real and uranium is real. But if I have a change of mind, I will hop right back on and let you know. But this is where it stands for me right now as far as this story about sulfur. I don't have any real conclusions. What I have for you is some advice. Take charge of your own body, take charge of your own life, get those windows open, go on a single source food diet. Not hard to do. I've been doing it now for several years now, and I'm still alive. So if you want to stay alive and on the game board, you might want to watch what you're eating, drinking, and how you're absorbing things. So I don't have any lectures for you over all of that. I'm sure you got the picture on other shows that I've done. So I'm going to close off for right now because I need to. And I hope that you found this information informative. My hope is maybe somebody will do something about it. I certainly can't do anything about it at this stage. It is all over the place. Is it really sulfur or is it really radiation? Is uranium real? I think uranium is real. I don't abide by this thing. It's all fake. That just is too easy. That's what they want you to think. So what they want us to think and what we really think are two different issues, and only we can decide on how we observe and absorb all of this information. So be safe out there and goodbye for now.